You ever watch someone powerful get stripped bare in front of the whole damn world? Not just losing money or status. I'm talking about the kind of fall that takes your name, your dignity, everything you thought was untouchable, and grinds it into the dirt while everyone you trusted stands there watching. That's where we start. A woman who had it all, about to walk into the throne room of the most dangerous man in the empire, not because she wants to, but because she's got no other choice left. Stick with me till the end. This story is going to take you places you didn't expect. Hit that like and drop your city in the comments so I know where my tribe's watching from. The corridor leading to Varian Thorn's throne hall stretched longer than Saris remembered, though she had never actually walked it before. Black marble veined with silver caught the torchlight in ways that made the walls seem alive, pulsing with the heartbeat of an empire built on ruthless precision. Every footfall echoed like a judgment already rendered. She could feel the weight of her worn traveling cloak against her shoulders, fabric that had once been fine but now bore the dust of 3 weeks on the road. Beneath it, her dress was the best she still owned, though best had become a relative term since the scandal broke. Her fingers trembled. She hated that they trembled. The guards flanking the entrance wore black armor that seemed to swallow light rather than reflect it. Neither looked at her as the massive doors swung inward with a groan that sounded almost like a warning. The throne hall opened before her like the mouth of some great beast, and for a moment Saris considered turning around, walking back out, finding another way to survive that didn't require standing before a man whose reputation arrived in rooms 3 steps ahead of his physical presence. But there was no other way. That truth had settled into her bones weeks ago, right around the time the last of her former friends stopped returning her letters. The hall itself defied easy description. It was vast without feeling empty, every inch of space calculated to remind visitors of their insignificance. Columns rose like the ribcage of some ancient god, and between them hung banners bearing the thorn sigil, a crown of thorns wrapped around a sword, stark white against black fabric. The symbolism wasn't subtle. Varian Thorn didn't deal in subtlety. At the far end, elevated on a dais of obsidian stone, sat the throne, and on the throne sat the king. Saris had heard the stories. Everyone had heard the stories. Varian Thorn, the Alpha Sovereign who had consolidated 7 fractious territories into a single empire before his 30th year, who had faced down 3 assassination attempts and turned each would-be killer's family into object lessons in the cost of treason. Who could break a man's will with nothing more than sustained eye contact, and had done so more than once in open court? The stories hadn't prepared her for the reality. He wasn't particularly large, not in the way of men who relied on physical intimidation, but there was something in the way he occupied space that made size irrelevant. He sat with the kind of stillness that came from absolute confidence, one hand resting on the arm of his throne, the other loose at his side. Dark hair fell to his shoulders, framing a face that would have been handsome if it weren't so utterly devoid of warmth. His eyes tracked her approach with the focus of a predator watching prey cross an open field. Saris had rehearsed this moment, had practiced her words until they felt smooth in her mouth, had mapped out exactly how to present her request in terms that appealed to his strategic interests rather than her desperate circumstances. But the moment his gaze locked onto hers, every carefully constructed phrase evaporated. Those eyes weren't just cold. They were knowing. They looked at her and saw not the polished presentation she had prepared, but the truth underneath, the sleepless nights, the mounting debts, the shame that sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't swallow. He saw her, completely and without mercy. Her throat went dry. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft crackle of torches. Somewhere in the shadows at the edge of the hall, she sensed other presences, advisors, guards, courtiers who had come to watch the king dispense whatever judgment or favor he deemed appropriate. She was performing for an audience she couldn't even see. Finally, Varian spoke. His voice carried without being raised, each word enunciated with the precision of someone who never needed to repeat himself. What brings Saris Halwyn to my court? Not a question. A command for information, stripped of any pretense at courtesy. She noted that he used her full name, not the title she'd been born to. Lady Halwyn existed in legal documents and fading memories, but apparently not in this hall. She straightened her spine. Whatever else had been taken from her, she still had that. The ability to stand upright even when everything inside her wanted to collapse. "I need your help," she said. The words came out steadier than she'd expected. Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features, gone so quickly she couldn't be certain it had been there at all. People who need my help typically offer something in return. What exactly do you bring to this negotiation besides desperation? The bluntness should have stung. Instead, it felt almost refreshing. No false sympathy, no performance of concern, just the transactional reality of power laid bare. Information, she said, about the eastern trade routes, about which noble houses are positioning themselves to... He held up one hand. She stopped mid-sentence. I have spies for information, he said, people considerably better positioned than a fallen noblewoman whose family's shipping contracts dried up 3 months ago. Try again. Ceres felt heat creep up her neck. He knew. Of course he knew. Baryon Thorn didn't rule an empire by being ignorant of who was rising and who was sinking within his territories. She took a breath that felt like swallowing glass. In 2 weeks, there's a wedding. Marquis Aldrich Vey is marrying Lady Celine Morith. It will be the social event of the season, attended by every major house in the empire. And 3 months ago, I was engaged to Aldrich. Understanding dawned in those cold eyes, and with it came something worse than contempt. Pity. Not the soft kind, but the hard-edged recognition of predictable human weakness. Let me guess, Varian said. He broke the engagement publicly, made certain everyone knew you were the defective party, spread rumors about your character, your family, maybe your virtue. And now he's marrying someone with better connections while you've been systematically frozen out of society. How am I doing so far? Each word landed like a physical blow because every single one was accurate. Aldrich had orchestrated her destruction with surgical precision, turning friends into strangers and strangers into enemies. He'd painted her as unstable, grasping, unsuitable for the position he needed his wife to fill. And because he was a marquis with influence, and she was merely the daughter of a merchant family elevated by a single generation of good fortune, people had believed him. Perfect, she said quietly. So you want what? Revenge. You want me to destroy him for you? No. Varion's eyebrows rose fractionally. In the weeks she'd spent preparing for this audience, Ceres had learned that he rarely showed surprise. This qualified. I want to attend that wedding, she continued, not as someone to be pitied or scorned, not as the discarded woman everyone expects to hide in shame. I want to walk into that hall as someone untouchable. Untouchable, he repeated, tasting the word. And you think my presence makes you untouchable? I think being associated with you makes me too dangerous to dismiss. Now he smiled. It was not a comforting expression. You've thought this through. I've thought of nothing else for 3 months. Varian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The casual posture somehow made him more intimidating, not less. So your plan is to ask me to attend a wedding as your escort, to stand beside you long enough to remind the jackals in fancy clothes that you have teeth after all. Then what? I disappear back to my fortress and you try to rebuild your life on the foundation of one evening's borrowed power. Ceres said nothing. Laid out like that, it sounded pathetic. It was pathetic. But it was also all she had. It won't work, he said flatly. Her stomach dropped. They'll see through it immediately, Varian continued. You show up with me cause a stir, then I leave, and you're right back where you started. Worse, actually, because then you've revealed your desperation and confirmed you have nothing real to offer. No lasting connection to power. No genuine value. Just a woman so broken she had to rent a king for one night. The words cut deeper than she'd expected. Maybe because they were true. Maybe because hearing her plan dissected in his clinical tone made her realize how thin it had always been. She closed her eyes. This had been her last option. Behind her eyelids, she could see the future unfolding, creditors seizing what remained of the family estate, the final dissolution of any social standing, years of slow-grinding poverty in some distant province where no one knew her name. When she opened her eyes again, Varian was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. However, he said slowly, there is a way to make this work. Hope flared in her chest, painful and desperate. If we're going to disrupt their narrative, we need to do it completely. Half measures get swallowed by gossip within a week. You need something they can't dismiss or explain away. What are you suggesting? Marriage. The word hung in the air between them like something physical. Ceres stared at him, certain she'd misheard. "Excuse me. Marry me," Varion said, with the same tone he might use to discuss trade agreements. Not romance, not sentiment, strategy. You attend that wedding not as someone borrowing power, but as my queen. That transforms the entire dynamic. Her mind reeled. This was insane. You're serious, she said. Completely. We don't know each other. Good. That makes it cleaner. No messy emotions to complicate the arrangement. This is insane. This is politics. He stood, descending the steps of the dais with measured precision. Up close, she could see details the distance had hidden. The thin scar along his jawline, the gray threading through his dark hair at the temples. The way his eyes weren't quite black, but rather a brown so dark it might as well be. The court has been circling me for years, he continued. Every noble house with a daughter of marriageable age has tried to position themselves for advantage. They want a queen they can manipulate, someone whose loyalty is divided between her husband and her family. By choosing you, someone with no family, no power base, no existing alliances, I eliminate their influence in one stroke. So I'm useful because I'm worthless. You're useful because you're uncomplicated. And because every single person who dismissed you, who participated in your destruction, will have to watch you rise above them and know they can never touch you again. She wanted to say no, should say no. This was a stranger offering a marriage of pure calculation, a contract wrapped in the trappings of legitimacy. But as she stood there in that vast hall, she thought about Aldrich's smug face, about former friends who had turned their backs, about creditors who spoke to her with barely concealed contempt. "What would you expect from me?" she asked carefully. "Competence, discretion, the ability to navigate court politics without creating unnecessary complications. You'll have resources, protection, status. In return, you'll serve as queen in all official capacities, attend functions, represent the crown when necessary, and privately. Privately, you'll have your own chambers, your own life. I won't demand more than the public requires. There had to be a catch. Men like Varian Thorn didn't make offers like this without hidden costs. Why? She said. Why would you really do this? He was quiet for a moment, and in that silence, Ceres thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes. Something that looked almost like exhaustion. "Because I'm tired of the game," he said finally. "Tired of nobles presenting their daughters like breeding stock, tired of every conversation being a negotiation, tired of pretending that any of them see me as anything other than a means to elevate their houses. You, at least, know exactly what this is. That makes you more honest than anyone else who stood in this hall seeking favor." It was, she realized, probably the closest thing to genuine feeling he would express. "How long do I have to decide?" she asked. "You already have. The question is whether you'll admit it to yourself." He was right. God help her. He was right. Because standing there in her worn dress with her trembling hands and her shattered pride, the choice had already been made. She could walk out of this hall and sink slowly into obscurity, or she could take the hand being offered and become something none of them expected. "One condition," she said. Varion tilted his head slightly. "Go on. I won't be decoration. If I'm going to be your queen, I want to actually matter. I want to know how the empire runs, who makes what decisions, where the power actually flows. I won't be kept ignorant." For the first time, something like respect entered his expression. "Agreed. Ignorant allies are liabilities." He extended his hand. Not a romantic gesture, a sealing of terms, a contract made flesh. Ceres took it. His grip was firm, warm, utterly impersonal. "Welcome to Nightfall Bastion, Queen Halwyn," he said. "We have 2 weeks to prepare you for war." The chambers they gave her could have swallowed her family's entire estate twice over. High ceilings disappeared into shadows, and windows overlooked a courtyard where guards drilled in perfect formation. Furniture that probably cost more than she'd ever owned sat arranged with careful precision. Everything was beautiful. Everything was cold. A servant appeared, silent, efficient, nameless. They brought food, drew a bath, laid out fresh clothes that actually fit properly. Ceres tried to thank them, but they disappeared before she could finish the sentence. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing. The bath was hot enough to burn, and she welcomed it. Needed to feel something physical to prove this was real and not some fever dream her desperate mind had conjured. When she finally lay down in a bed that felt like floating on clouds, sleep refused to come. Instead, she stared at the ceiling and tried to process what she'd just done. She'd agreed to marry a man she didn't know, a king whose empire was built on calculated violence and strategic cruelty, a stranger who looked at her and saw not a person but a chess piece that happened to serve his purposes. And in 2 weeks, she would stand before Aldrich and everyone who had destroyed her, and she would be untouchable. The thought should have brought satisfaction. Instead, it just felt hollow. A knock on the door pulled her from her spiraling thoughts. "Enter," she called, sitting up. The door opened. A woman stepped through, older, perhaps 50, with iron gray hair pulled into a severe bun and eyes that evaluated everything they saw. She wore dark robes that marked her as someone of status, though not nobility. "You're awake," the woman said. "Good. We have work to do, and you are." Mayra, the king's senior advisor. "Also, apparently, your keeper for the next 2 weeks. Theris bristled. "I don't need a keeper." "Everyone in this fortress needs a keeper, dear. The question is whether you're smart enough to recognize that keeping you alive and functional serves my interests too." The bluntness was starting to feel like a pattern in Vearion's court. "What kind of work?" Theris asked. Mira settled into a chair with the ease of someone who had claimed spaces in this fortress for decades. The kind that keeps you from getting eviscerated in your first week as queen. You think walking into that wedding on Varian's arm is the hard part. That's just theater. The real challenge starts the morning after, when every noble house tries to figure out how to use you, undermine you, or eliminate you as a threat. Wonderful. The court is an ecosystem of predators, dear. Right now, you're a new variable they haven't accounted for. That makes you dangerous, which means they'll either try to control you or destroy you. Our job is to make sure you're too valuable to destroy and too smart to control. How exactly do we do that? Information. Mira leaned forward. You learn who holds what power and why. You understand which alliances are solid and which are performance. You figure out who actually runs things versus who just pretends to. And you never ever reveal more than you intend to. This sounds exhausting. Oh, it is. It absolutely is. But the alternative is being decorative until you stop being useful, at which point you'll disappear the way inconvenient queens always do. Quietly. Permanently. The casual way she said it sent ice down Ceres's spine. Varion says a lot of things, and he means them, mostly. But he's a king, dear. Kings sacrifice pieces to win games. Your survival depends on making yourself the piece he can't afford to lose. Then why help me? Mira smiled thinly. Because I'm tired of watching vapid noblewomen parade through here expecting the crown to be a pretty accessory. You at least know you're in danger. That's a start. Over the next hour, Mira laid out the landscape of the court with clinical precision. Houses that had been trying to marry their daughters to Vearion for years. Advisors who would see Ceres as a threat to their influence. Generals who viewed anyone without military background as fundamentally worthless. Merchants who would try to cultivate her favor for access to the crown. It was overwhelming. It was terrifying. It was exactly what she'd asked for. "One more thing," Mira said as she stood to leave. "The king wants you to join him for dinner tomorrow. Private. Just the two of you." "Why?" "Probably to establish ground rules, maybe to see if you're capable of intelligent conversation. Varion doesn't tolerate fools well. What if I say the wrong thing? Then you'll learn quickly why no one challenges him twice." Mira moved toward the door, then paused. "But between you and me, I don't think you will." "Why not?" "Because you already understand the most important lesson, that this is a performance. The ones who fail are the ones who forget their acting." After she left, Ceres sat in the silence of her enormous chamber and tried not to think about how many ways this could destroy her. She'd escaped one form of ruin only to volunteer for another potentially worse one. But at least this time, she'd chosen it herself. That had to count for something. Dinner the following night was served in a room that was somehow more intimate and more intimidating than the throne hall. Smaller space, darker lighting, a table that sat only two. Varion was already there when she arrived, reading through documents with the kind of focus that suggested he genuinely didn't notice her entrance. She cleared her throat. He looked up, scanned her once, then gestured to the seat across from him. Sit. She sat. Servants materialized with food, actual hot food, not the cold rations she'd survived on during the journey here. The smell alone made her mouth water. Eat, Varian said, not looking up from his papers. They ate in silence for several minutes. Saris tried to pace herself, tried not to appear too desperate, but the food was good enough that restraint felt like torture. Finally, Varian set his documents aside. Mira says you're a quick study. Mira seems competent. She is. Also ruthless. Also one of the few people in this fortress who would kill to protect what we've built here. Trust her. Noted. He studied her with that unnerving directness. Tell me about Aldrich Vey. The question landed like a punch. Saris set down her fork carefully. What do you want to know? Why him? What did you see that made you agree to marry him? She considered lying, considered deflecting. But Mira's words echoed. Never reveal more than you intend, which meant knowing exactly how much to reveal. Security, she said. My family's fortune was recent. We had money, but not legitimacy. Aldrich offered both. Marriage to a marquis would have solidified our position, given my children a claim to real nobility. It made sense. Practical. Entirely. And you loved him? No. Varian's expression shifted slightly. She'd surprised him again. No, she repeated. I liked him well enough. Respected what he was building. Thought we could make a functional partnership. But love? No, that wasn't part of the calculation. So why did the betrayal hurt? Now she did hesitate. This was dangerous territory, showing vulnerability to a man who collected weaknesses the way other people collected art. But he'd asked directly. And something told her that lying to Varian was more dangerous than truth. Because I trusted him, she said quietly. Not with my heart, with my reputation. I thought we had an agreement. Turns out agreements mean nothing when someone decides you're no longer useful. Varian leaned back in his chair, wineglass in hand. What did he tell them? About why he broke the engagement. That I was unstable. Prone to jealousy and irrational behavior. That I'd accused him of infidelity without proof. Made scenes at gatherings. Threatened his household staff. And did you? Of course not. But who's going to believe the woman who just got discarded over the marquis, with connections to half the noble houses in the empire? So he destroyed you preemptively. Made sure if you tried to defend yourself, it would just confirm his narrative. Exactly. Smart, Varian said. Cruel, but smart. Saris felt something hot and bitter rise in her throat. You admire it. I recognize competence when I see it. Whether I admire the character behind it is irrelevant. She wanted to argue, wanted to demand he acknowledge that what Aldrich had done was monstrous. But she was beginning to understand that Varian saw the world through a lens that didn't account for moral outrage, only effectiveness. Your turn, she said. Why are you really doing this? I told you. The real reason. Not the strategic justification. Silence stretched between them. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, then, because I'm tired of being treated like a trophy to be won. Every woman who's been presented to me in the last 5 years has looked at me and seen the crown. Not the person, just the power they could access through marriage. You at least want the crown for what it can do, not what it represents. That's honest. It was, she realized, probably the most personal thing he'd said to her. Does it bother you? She asked. Being seen as power instead of person? No, it's accurate. That's what I am. That's what you chose to become. Correction. That's what survival required me to become. His voice had gone hard. You don't consolidate an empire by being soft. You don't maintain control by allowing sentiment to cloud judgment. I am power. Everything else is illusion. Saris met his gaze across the table. That sounds lonely. Loneliness is a luxury. Kings don't get luxuries. Everyone gets lonely. Then everyone is weak. She should have stopped, should have recognized the warning in his tone, but something in her refused to let it go. Weakness and humanity aren't the same thing. In my experience, they're close enough. Your experience is limited. Now his eyes went cold, dangerous, careful. I'm just saying, you've built everything around the assumption that caring about anything makes you vulnerable. But isolation isn't strength, it's just isolation. And what would you know about strength? The question was meant to cut. It did. Sari set her glass down with precise control. I know what it costs to stand up after everyone you trusted tries to bury you. I know what it feels like to wake up every morning and choose survival over surrender. I know that asking for help when you have nothing left doesn't make you weak. It makes you practical. So no, I don't know your kind of strength, but I know mine. Silence fell like a stone. Then Varian did something unexpected. He laughed. Not a pleasant sound, but genuine. Mira was right about you, he said. You've got spine. Is that a compliment? It's an observation. Whether it's a compliment depends on whether it keeps you alive. The conversation shifted after that. Safer topics, court logistics, the formal schedule for the next 2 weeks. But something had changed in the dynamic between them. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. Two people who'd both been betrayed by sentiment, choosing calculation instead. As she walked back to her chambers later that night, Saris realized she'd just had the most honest conversation of her life with a man who terrified most of the Empire. She still didn't know if that made her brave or suicidal. The days that followed blurred into a relentless schedule of preparation. Mira drilled her on court politics until names and alliances swam in her head. A seamstress appeared to create appropriate wardrobes, not the delicate pastels favored by most noble women, but darker colors, richer fabrics, clothing that conveyed presence rather than decoration. Protocol instructors taught her the specific ways to move through formal events, how to hold herself, which gestures conveyed what meanings. It was exhausting. It was also consuming enough that she didn't have time to spiral into doubt. Valerian appeared periodically, always without warning. Sometimes he'd observe her lessons in silence, his presence turning every interaction into a performance. Sometimes he'd ask sharp questions that revealed whether she actually understood what she was being taught. Once he'd corrected her directly in front of the protocol instructor, demonstrating proper form by physically adjusting her posture with hands that were impersonal and precise. She'd hated how aware she became of his proximity in those moments. 5 days before the wedding, he summoned her to his private study. She'd never been there before. It was smaller than she expected, lined with books and maps, a workspace rather than a display of power. Varian sat behind a desk covered in documents, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked tired. "Sit," he said without looking up. She sat. He continued reading for another minute, then finally set the papers aside. "We need to discuss what happens at the wedding," he said. "Specifically, how we handle the moment when Aldrich realizes what you've done. I assume there will be shock. There will be fury. Aldrich is not a man who handles losing gracefully, especially when he's been outmaneuvered publicly. He'll try to regain control of the narrative." "How?" "Words, most likely. He'll say something designed to humiliate you, to remind everyone present of the scandal he created. He'll try to make you react emotionally. And what should I do?" "Nothing." "Nothing." Varian leaned forward. "Let me handle it. The moment he tries to diminish you, I'll intervene. Not with anger. Anger is sloppy. With precision. I'll dismantle whatever power play he attempts in a way that makes it clear attacking you is attacking the crown. You'll destroy him. I'll neutralize him. There's a difference. Destruction is personal. Neutralization is strategic." She studied his face, trying to read intent behind those dark eyes. "Why does this matter to you?" she asked. "Really, it's just a wedding, just theater, like you said. Because every eye in that hall will be watching to see if I defend you. If I hesitate, even for a moment, they'll know this marriage is a sham. They'll know you're not really under my protection, and then everything we've built collapses. So it's still just strategy. Of course it's strategy. What else would it be?" But she heard something in his voice that contradicted the words. Something that sounded almost like he was trying to convince himself. "1 week," she said quietly. "1 week ago, I walked into your throne hall with nothing. Now I'm about to stand in front of the man who destroyed me as your queen. This doesn't feel like strategy anymore." Then you're confused. Varian stood, moving to the window. "Strategy is all it can be. Anything else is weakness. You keep saying that because it's true." "Is it?" He turned to face her, and for just a moment, his carefully maintained control slipped. She saw something raw beneath it, something that looked like it had been wounded a long time ago and never properly healed. "Yes," he said, and the certainty in his voice felt like armor. It has to be. Before she could respond, a knock interrupted. A messenger entered, whispered something to Varian, disappeared. "We're done here," Varian said, dismissing her without ceremony. Ceres stood, moving toward the door. But at the threshold, she paused. "For what it's worth," she said, "I don't think you're as cold as you pretend to be." She didn't wait for a response, didn't look back to see his expression, just walked out and let the door close between them. The night before the wedding, Ceres couldn't sleep. She stood at her window watching the fortress grounds below, guards moving in their eternal patterns, torches burning against the darkness. Tomorrow she would step into the role she'd agreed to. Tomorrow, everything changed. Another knock. She was starting to recognize them by rhythm. Mira's was brisk, servants were hesitant, Varian's were. She opened the door. Valerian stood there, still fully dressed despite the late hour. In his hand, a small wooden box. "Can't sleep," he said. "Neither can I." "Helpful." He stepped inside without asking permission, moving to her window. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, he held out the box. "What is it?" she asked. "Open it." Inside, nestled in dark velvet, sat a ring. Not delicate, not decorative. A band of dark metal set with a single stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "It was my mother's," Varian said quietly. "The only thing of hers I kept after she died." Ceres stared at it, understanding the weight of what he was offering. "I can't." "You can. You're about to be queen. You need something that looks like it belongs on a queen's hand. Might as well be something real." She lifted the ring carefully. It was heavier than it looked. "Tell me about her." Varian was quiet long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. "She was stronger than anyone gave her credit for," he said finally. "Married my father for political reasons, same as we're doing. Spent 20 years navigating a court that wanted her to be decoration. When he died and I inherited, half the nobles assumed she'd fade into obscurity. Instead, she taught me everything I needed to know about how power actually works. Who to trust, who to use, who to eliminate. She sounds formidable. She was. Until she got sick. Then she was just mortal, like everyone else. I'm sorry. Don't be. Death comes for everyone eventually. She just faced it better than most." Theris slipped the ring onto her finger. Perfect fit. "How did you know my size?" "I pay attention." They stood at the window together, two people bound by calculation, watching darkness hold the world outside. Somewhere in the distance, dawn was coming. And with it, the moment of transformation neither could take back. "Tomorrow," Varian said, "when we walk into that hall, there's no going back. Whatever happens afterward will be defined by this choice." "I know. Are you afraid? Terrified?" "Good. Fear keeps you sharp. It's certainty that gets you killed." Ceres turned to look at him. In the low light, he looked almost human, almost vulnerable. Almost like someone who might understand what it meant to risk everything on a gamble that could destroy you. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For seeing me. When everyone else just saw something broken." Varian met her eyes, and for once, there was no coldness there. Just recognition. Just another person who'd learned that survival meant becoming something harder than what tried to break you. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow, we go to war." He left without another word. Ceres looked at the ring on her finger, dark metal catching no light, perfectly suited to the woman she was becoming. Outside, the first gray hints of dawn began to touch the horizon. In 12 hours, she would stand before everyone who had destroyed her. In 12 hours, she would become untouchable. In 12 hours, Ceres Halwyn would cease to exist, and in her place would stand a queen. She just hoped she was strong enough to survive what came after. The carriage ride to the Vey estate felt longer than the 3 weeks Ceres had spent on the road, getting to Nightfall Bastion. Every jolt of the wheels against stone reminded her that she was moving toward a confrontation she'd fantasized about for months, but never actually believed would happen. Across from her sat Varian, perfectly still despite the movement, reading through correspondence as if they were heading to a routine administrative meeting rather than a deliberate act of social warfare. She'd expected him to wear full royal regalia, crown, ceremonial armor, the works. Instead, he'd chosen black and silver, elegant but understated, The kind of outfit that didn't announce power so much as assume everyone already knew it was there. The only concession to formality was a ring on his right hand, the thorn sigil carved into dark metal. Her own dress had been Mira's choice. Deep crimson, almost black in certain light, with a neckline that suggested confidence rather than seduction. The ring Varion had given her the night before sat heavy on her hand, catching her attention every time she moved. "You're thinking too much," Varion said without looking up from his papers. "I'm preparing. You're spiraling. There's a difference." "How would you know?" "Because I can hear you breathing like you're about to face an execution." He finally looked at her, those dark eyes reading her with uncomfortable accuracy. "Stop rehearsing. The moment you try to control every word, you'll sound scripted. React honestly. That's more dangerous than any planned speech. Easy for you to say." "No, it's not." He set his papers aside. "You think I don't prepare for these situations? I spend hours analyzing every possible angle, every potential response. Then I walk in and throw half of it away because people are unpredictable. The best you can do is know your objective and adapt. And what's my objective? To stand there and let them see that you're untouchable. Nothing more complicated than that." The carriage slowed. Through the window, Saris could see the Vey estate rising like something out of a dream she'd once had, and then forgotten. White marble columns, gardens manicured to impossible perfection, carriages lining the approach in a display of wealth that bordered on obscene. 3 months ago, she'd imagined arriving here as Aldrich's bride. The thought felt like it belonged to a different person entirely. The moment the carriage stopped, servants appeared. The door opened. Varion stepped out first, extending his hand to her with the kind of casual authority that made the gesture look natural rather than rehearsed. She took it, felt the strength in his grip, the absolute certainty in the way he moved. As her feet touched the ground, she heard the whisper start, saw heads turn, watched as recognition rippled through the crowd of arriving guests like a stone thrown into still water. Valerian kept her hand on his arm as they walked toward the entrance. He didn't rush. Didn't acknowledge the stairs, just moved with the kind of deliberate pace that forced everyone else to adjust to his rhythm. At the entrance, a herald stood ready to announce arrivals. The man took one look at Varion and went pale. "His Majesty King Varion Thorn," the herald managed, voice cracking slightly, and "Queen Saris Halwyn," Valerion finished for him, the correction so smooth it sounded like he was simply clarifying a minor point. The silence that followed was absolute. Then they stepped inside, and Saris felt the full weight of 200 pairs of eyes lock onto her simultaneously. The grand hall had been decorated within an inch of its life. Flowers everywhere, ribbons in the Vey house colors, tables laden with food that most of the guests wouldn't actually eat. At the far end, she could see Aldrich and his bride-to-be holding court, surrounded by admirers and well-wishers. Celine Morath wore white and gold, looking exactly like what she was. Young, beautiful, perfectly suitable for the role of Marquis's wife. Aldrich saw them. She watched the recognition hit him, watched his expression cycle through confusion, disbelief, and then something that looked almost like fear before settling into forced composure. Varion felt it too. She could tell by the slight pressure of his hand over hers, a wordless communication that said he'd seen it and was already calculating his next move. They moved deeper into the hall. Conversations died as they passed, then restarted in urgent whispers. Saris kept her spine straight, her expression neutral. Let them look. Let them wonder. Let them try to reconcile the woman they dismissed with the queen standing before them. A few brave souls approached to offer congratulations, their words carefully neutral, their eyes hungry for any hint of weakness or scandal. Varion handled them with practiced ease, his responses polite and utterly devoid of useful information. Then Aldrich himself appeared, Celine at his side, wearing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Your Majesty," he said, bowing with just enough depth to be respectful without being obsequious. "What an unexpected honor. We hadn't realized you planned to attend." "Plans change," Varian said mildly. "When I learned my queen had a prior connection to your house, it seemed appropriate to offer congratulations in person. The emphasis on my queen was subtle but unmistakable." Aldrich's jaw tightened fractionally. "Of course." He turned to Saris, and she saw the calculation behind his eyes. "Saris, you look well." Your Majesty, Varian corrected, his voice dropping just enough to carry a warning. You're addressing the Queen. Protocol requires her title. Something ugly flickered across Aldrich's face before he could suppress it. My apologies, Your Majesty. I must confess, I'm surprised. The last I heard, you were dealing with some rather unfortunate circumstances. There it was. The opening strike. The subtle reminder of her fall designed to reestablish the power dynamic he'd created. Ceres felt Varian's hand tighten slightly on her arm. A warning or reassurance, she couldn't tell which. Circumstances change, she said evenly, as I'm sure you've noticed. Indeed. And so quickly. Why, it feels like just yesterday you were— Aldrich, Varian interrupted, his tone still pleasant but with an edge that could cut glass. I find myself curious about something. Your engagement to Lady Ceres ended quite publicly, as I understand it, over concerns about her character. Aldrich's smile became fixed. That's correct. And yet here she stands as Queen of the Realm, which suggests either your judgment was catastrophically flawed or your concerns were never actually legitimate. I wonder which it is. The hall had gone quiet around them. People weren't even pretending not to listen anymore. Aldrich opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Ceres watched him realize in real time that there was no good answer. Admitting he'd been wrong made him look incompetent. Doubling down on his accusations meant directly insulting the Queen in front of the king. I'm sure it was simply a misunderstanding, Celine interjected smoothly, trying to diffuse the situation. These things happen. Do they? Varian said, turning his attention to her. How interesting that you'd marry a man prone to such significant misunderstandings about women's characters. One might wonder what misunderstandings await you. Celine paled. Aldrich looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. But I'm sure it will work out beautifully, Varian continued, his tone suggesting the exact opposite. After all, Aldrich has such a strong track record of honoring his commitments. It was surgical, precise. He just publicly questioned Aldrich's judgment, his integrity, and his reliability, all while maintaining the veneer of pleasant conversation. And he'd done it in a way that made responding defensively look petty. Ceres had known Varian was dangerous, but watching him work was something else entirely. We should let you return to your guests, Varian said, already turning away. Do enjoy your wedding. I'm sure it will be memorable. They moved off, leaving Aldrich and Celine standing there trying to figure out what had just happened. You didn't let me say anything, Ceres murmured once they were out of earshot. You didn't need to. Your presence said everything necessary. The words were just cleanup. That was brutal. That was restrained. He glanced at her. You wanted him neutralized. He's neutralized. By tomorrow, everyone here will be questioning whether his judgment can be trusted. His political value just dropped considerably. And Celine. Collateral damage. She chose to marry him knowing what he did to you. That choice has consequences. They found seats at one of the less crowded tables. Servants appeared with wine and food that Ceres had no appetite for. Around them, the whispers continued, speculation building on speculation. Across the hall, she could see Aldrich in conversation with several older nobles, his gestures sharp with frustration. Whatever he was saying wasn't landing well. She watched one of them shake his head and walk away. He's trying to do damage control, Varian observed. It's not working. How can you tell? Because if it were working, they'd be looking at you with suspicion. Instead, they're looking at him with concern. They're wondering what else he's lied about. Does it bother you? Being this calculating, why would it? Because it's people's lives, their reputations. Varian set down his wine glass with deliberate care. Aldrich destroyed your reputation without a second thought, used you to clear the way for a better political match, turned your friends against you, made you a cautionary tale. And now you want me to feel bad about returning the favor. I didn't say that. Then what are you saying? I don't know. Maybe I'm just realizing that winning doesn't feel the way I thought it would. He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. That's because you're not like me, he said finally. You still think victories should feel good, should fill the empty spaces. They don't. They just create new ones. Before she could respond, the ceremony began. A priest took position at the front of the hall, and guests arranged themselves to witness the actual wedding. Aldrich and Celine moved to stand before him, both trying to project happiness despite the tension visible in their shoulders. Ceres watched as vows were exchanged, as rings were placed, as the priest pronounced them bound for life. Part of her had expected to feel something: jealousy, grief, anger. Instead, she just felt distant, like she was watching something happening to strangers in a story she'd already heard the ending to. Varion's hand found hers under the table. Not a romantic gesture, just an anchor, a reminder that she wasn't watching this alone. The ceremony concluded. Applause filled the hall. Aldrich and Celine turned to face their guests, wearing smiles that looked increasingly strained. And then Aldrich made his mistake. He looked directly at Ceres, and in front of everyone assembled, he said loud enough to carry, "I hope your new arrangement works out better than our last understanding. Though I suppose when expectations are low enough, anything seems like an improvement." The hall went dead silent. Ceres felt Varion go absolutely still beside her, not tense. Still, like a predator that had just sighted prey. When he stood, it was with the kind of deliberate movement that made everyone instinctively step back. "Aldrich," Varion said, his voice carrying perfectly in the silence, "I'm going to give you one opportunity to retract that statement and apologize to my queen." Aldrich's face had gone white. He clearly hadn't expected Varion to respond so directly, so publicly. "Your Majesty, I only meant—" "No. You meant to humiliate her, to remind her of her place, to assert some pathetic remnant of power over someone who's now so far above you that you can't even see the distance. So here's what's going to happen." Varion descended from their table, moving toward Aldrich with measured steps. "You're going to apologize, sincerely, in front of every person in this hall. And then you're going to understand something very clearly. My queen is under my protection. Insulting her is insulting the crown, and insulting the crown has consequences." He stopped directly in front of Aldrich, close enough that the difference in their positions was unmistakable. King and subject, sovereign and subordinate. So apologize. Now, before I decide that words aren't sufficient recompense. The threat was implicit but clear. Aldrich could apologize, or he could face whatever punishment Varion deemed appropriate. In his own home, at his own wedding, in front of everyone he'd invited to celebrate his triumph. Aldrich's hands were shaking, actually shaking. "I apologize," he managed. "Your Majesty." I spoke thoughtlessly. "It won't happen again. No, it won't, because if it does, you'll discover exactly how creative I can be with treason charges." Valerian held his gaze for another beat, letting the moment stretch until it became unbearable. Then he turned and walked back to Ceres, extending his hand. "We're leaving," he said simply. She took his hand, let him pull her to her feet. Together they walked through the hall, guests parting like water before them, and out into the night air where their carriage waited. Neither spoke until they were inside and moving. Then Ceres started laughing. She couldn't help it. The absurdity of it all, Aldrich's humiliation, Varion's controlled fury, the way every careful plan had been blown apart by one stupid comment. "You threatened him with treason," she said between laughs. "Technically, I threatened him with creative treason charges." "There's a distinction." "Is there really?" "No, but it sounds more ominous." She looked at him, this king who'd just publicly defended her honor with the kind of cold precision that made it clear attacking her meant war. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "Yes, I did. Why?" For the first time since she'd met him, Varion looked uncertain, like he was trying to work out the answer to a question he hadn't meant to ask himself. "Because he doesn't get to diminish you," he said finally. "Not anymore. Not ever again. Because it would make the arrangement look weak." Valerion met her eyes in the dim light of the carriage. "No. Because you've earned better than that. And because somewhere in the last 2 weeks, I stopped seeing this as purely transactional. The admission hung between them like something fragile." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that defending you tonight wasn't strategy. It was choice. And I'm not entirely certain when that changed." Ceres felt something shift in her chest. Something dangerous and complicated and entirely at odds with the careful emotional distance they'd maintained. "Varion, don't." He held up a hand. "Don't say whatever you're about to say. Not yet. We need to think about what this means, about whether we're willing to accept the complications. What complications? If this becomes real, if we start making decisions based on sentiment rather than strategy, everything gets harder. The court will see it as weakness. My enemies will exploit it. Every choice becomes weighted with emotional cost instead of just tactical consideration. And that terrifies you. Yes. Why? Because he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looking more vulnerable than she'd ever seen him. Because I built everything on the foundation of not caring, not letting anyone close enough to become a liability, not risking attachment that could be used against me. And now you're sitting here with my mother's ring on your finger, and I just publicly declared that insulting you means war, and I can't pretend that was purely political calculation. The carriage rattled through the night. Outside, the world continued like nothing had changed. Inside, Saris felt the ground shifting beneath everything they'd agreed to. "So what do we do?" she asked quietly. "I don't know. I genuinely don't know. You always know." "Not about this. This wasn't part of the plan. Plans change. You said that yourself. Not like this. Not in ways that make me vulnerable." She reached across the space between them, placing her hand over his. "Maybe vulnerability isn't the same as weakness. It is when you're a king." "Is it? Or is that just what you've convinced yourself because the alternative is terrifying?" Varian didn't pull away from her touch, but she could feel the tension in him, the war between instinct and control. "If I let this be real," he said slowly, "if I start making decisions with you in mind rather than just the crown, I risk everything I've built. And if you don't, then I keep the empire and lose." He paused. "Something I didn't know I wanted until it was already here. What if you could have both? No one gets both. That's not how power works. Maybe you've been doing it wrong." The words came out sharper than she intended, but she didn't take them back. Because she'd watched him for 2 weeks now, seen how he'd constructed a life of absolute control and absolute isolation. How he'd convinced himself that caring about anything made him weak. And she'd seen tonight how wrong that was. "Every person in that hall feared you," she continued, "but they didn't respect you. Not really. They respected your power, but when you defended me, when you made it clear that I mattered to you, that changed. For the first time, they saw you as someone who values something beyond pure strategy, and that made you more dangerous, not less. How do you figure? Because now they don't know your limits. When you didn't care about anything, you were predictable. Brutal, but predictable. Now they have to wonder what else might trigger that kind of response. What other lines they can't see because you've never revealed them before." Varian was quiet for a long time. "You're suggesting that caring makes me less predictable," he said finally. "I'm suggesting that showing you care makes you more complex, and complex is harder to manipulate than simple. And when someone uses that care against me, when they threaten you to force my hand, then you deal with it the way you deal with everything else, with overwhelming force and zero tolerance, but you don't preemptively eliminate the possibility of connection just because it might be weaponized. That's not strength. That's just being afraid." The words landed hard. She saw them hit, saw Varian flinch almost imperceptibly. "I'm not afraid. Everyone's afraid of something, even kings. What are you afraid of?" The question caught her off guard. She'd been so focused on pushing him to acknowledge his own fears that she hadn't considered hers. "I'm afraid," she said slowly, "that I'll get used to this, to being protected, to having power. And then something will happen to take it away, and I'll be right back where I started. Except worse, because now I'll know what I'm missing. So you're afraid of losing what you've gained. I'm afraid of needing it. There's a difference. Is there? Yes. Losing something you have hurts, needing something you might lose destroys you." Varian smiled, but it was a sad expression. "So we're both afraid of attachment for different reasons. You because you've lost before, and I because I've never had anything worth losing in the first place. Is that what I am to you? Something worth losing? I don't know yet, but I think I'm starting to find out." The carriage began to slow. Through the window, Saris could see the familiar walls of Nightfall Bastion rising against the night sky. Home. When had she started thinking of it that way? They came to a stop. Servants appeared to open doors and lower steps. Varian exited first, then turned to help her down. But instead of releasing her hand once she was on solid ground, he held it. stood there in the courtyard with guards watching and servants hovering, and kept her hand in his like he was trying to decide something. "I need time," he said finally, "to think about what this means, what I'm willing to risk. I know, but I'm not going to pretend tonight didn't happen, that I didn't feel something when he insulted you, that defending you was purely political. I wouldn't want you to." He lifted her hand, pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture that was formal and intimate all at once. "Whatever we decide," he said, "whatever this becomes, you need to understand something. The moment I claimed you publicly, I made you a target. Everyone who wants to control me or undermine me will see you as the lever to do it. That danger doesn't go away just because we acknowledge what's happening between us. I understand. Do you? Because it's not theoretical. It's real. And it's coming. Then we handle it. Together." He studied her face like he was trying to memorize it. "You're either very brave or very foolish. Can it be both?" That pulled a genuine smile from him, brief but real. "Go get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow we deal with the fallout from tonight." "What fallout?" "By now, half the noble houses in the empire know what happened. They'll be trying to figure out how to use it. We need to be ahead of them. Always strategy. Always. Until it's not." He released her hand and stepped back, creating distance again. But something had changed in the space between them, something neither could take back. Cerys walked to her chambers, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger, the memory of his lips against her knuckles, the knowledge that they'd just crossed a line that transformed everything. Mira was waiting for her, sitting in the same chair she'd occupied during their first conversation weeks ago. "Well," she said without preamble, "that was quite the performance." Cerys removed her cloak, suddenly exhausted. He nearly started a war over an insult. Nearly. Mira's expression was knowing, but didn't. Because he's still Veerion, and Veerion calculates even when he's angry. The question is whether you understand what you just witnessed. What do you mean? I mean, Veerion has never publicly defended anyone's honor before, never revealed that anything beyond strategic value matters to him. And he just did both in the same evening, in front of the most politically connected gathering of the season. So you're no longer just a convenient political move. You're someone the king cares about, and that changes everything. Cerys sank into a chair. He's terrified of it. Of course he is. Caring makes you vulnerable. For someone who's built an empire on being invulnerable, that's essentially admitting to a fatal flaw. Is it? A fatal flaw. Mira was quiet for a moment. That depends on whether the two of you can figure out how to be human and powerful at the same time. Most people can't manage it, kings especially. Did you? When you cared about someone, who says I ever did? The way you talk about protecting this empire, about keeping Veerion safe, that's not just professional loyalty. Mira's expression flickered. For just a moment, something old and painful crossed her face. "I loved someone once," she said quietly. "A general in the king's army. Veerion's father's army. He died in a pointless border skirmish because the old king was too proud to negotiate. And I learned that loving someone who serves power means watching power consume them eventually." "I'm sorry. Don't be. Just learn from it. If you and Veerion are going to make this work, you can't both be entirely consumed by the crown. Someone has to remember that there's more to life than strategy and survival." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'm tired of watching good people get destroyed by the machinery of power. And because I think you might be strong enough to hold on to your humanity even when everything is trying to strip it away." After Mira left, Cerys lay in bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about everything that had shifted. A month ago, she'd been desperate and ruined. 2 weeks ago, she'd agreed to a marriage of pure strategy. Tonight, she'd watched a king reveal that he cared about something beyond power. And somewhere in all of that, she'd started caring back. That should have terrified her. Did terrify her. Because Mira was right. Caring meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant risk, and risk meant possible destruction. But lying there in the darkness, remembering the way Veerion had gone absolutely still before defending her, the way he'd admitted that his response wasn't strategic, the way he'd held her hand in the courtyard like he was trying to hold on to something real in a world of calculated illusions. She realized she was willing to take the risk. The next morning brought the consequences Veerion had predicted. By the time Cerys made it to the council chamber where he'd summoned her, 3 separate messengers had delivered urgent correspondence from noble houses wanting to understand the implications of last night's events. Valerion sat at the head of a long table covered in papers, looking like he hadn't slept. Mira stood beside him, along with 2 other advisors Saris recognized but hadn't formally met. "They want to know if the crown is stable," Varion said without preamble as she entered. "Whether my attachment to you represents a weakness they can exploit." "And what are you telling them?" "Nothing yet. I wanted to hear your thoughts first." Saris moved to the table, scanning the correspondence. Letters from Duke Torhen, from Lady Vasira, from half a dozen others expressing concern that was really calculation dressed in diplomatic language. "They're testing," she said, "trying to figure out if I'm a vulnerability or an asset." "Exactly. So make me an asset." Varion looked up from his papers. "Explain. You've spent years being untouchable, isolated, impossible to manipulate because you don't care about anything except the Empire. Last night you revealed that's no longer entirely true. They see that as an opening. It is an opening, only if you let them define what it means. Instead, use me. Make it clear that I'm not a weakness to exploit, but extension of your will. Give me actual authority, real responsibilities. Force them to go through me to get to you, and make that path so difficult it's not worth trying." One of the advisors, an older man with a military bearing, shook his head. "That's too risky. Making her a genuine power player invites direct attacks." "Which is better than them thinking she's just decoration to be worked around," Saris countered. "If I'm genuinely powerful in my own right, attacking me becomes attacking the crown directly. If I'm just window dressing, I'm an easy target." Varion leaned back in his chair, studying her. "You've been thinking about this all night, and you're willing to accept the danger that comes with actual authority. I'm already in danger. At least this way I'm dangerous back." A smile ghosted across his features. "Mira, your assessment. The woman who'd become something close to Saris's ally in the past week stepped forward. She's right. We can either position her as a vulnerability or as an extension of the crown's power. Given how last night played out, trying to walk back the king's attachment isn't viable. So we lean into it. Make the queen someone they have to take seriously." The military advisor still looked skeptical. "What kind of authority are we talking about?" Varion's eyes didn't leave Saris's face. "What do you want?" She'd thought about this, spent the sleepless hours mapping out exactly what kind of power would both serve the Empire and protect her position. "Trade oversight," she said. "Merchant guild negotiations, port authority appointments. Nothing military or directly political yet, but enough that I control real resources and have genuine influence over the economy." "Why those areas specifically?" "Because my family built their fortune on trade. I understand the mechanics. And because the merchant class is the one group that's never quite been fully integrated into the power structure. They have money, but not status. Status, but not security. Give me authority over their concerns, and I become valuable to a constituency that can actually push back against the noble houses." Varion was nodding slowly. "You want to build your own power base. I want to make sure that if something happens to you, I'm not immediately disposable." The bluntness of it seemed to surprise everyone except Varion himself. He just looked at her with something that might have been approval. "Smart," he said. "Brutal, but smart. You're thinking like a survivor." "I am a survivor." "Yes, you are." He stood, moving around the table to where she stood. "If I give you this authority, you understand what it means. You're not just my queen in name. You become a genuine player in your own right. That means real work, real accountability, real danger. I understand, and you're willing to accept that. I'm willing to demand it." That got a genuine laugh from him. Brief, but real. "All right then?" He turned to his advisors. "Draft the necessary orders. As of today, Queen Saris has full authority over trade negotiations, merchant guild oversight, and port appointments within the Empire. Anyone with concerns about trade policy brings them to her. Anyone seeking merchant contracts goes through her office." "Your Majesty," the military advisor started. "Is there a problem, General?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Your Majesty." "Good. Because if there was, I'd be very interested to hear you explain why empowering my queen represents a problem for the crown. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Support this decision or reveal yourself as someone who questions the king's judgment." The general bowed stiffly and left. The other advisors followed, leaving just Valerion, Saris, and Meira. "You just painted a target on your back," Meira said to Saris. "I hope you understand that. I do. And you're prepared for what comes next." "No. But I will be." Meira looked at Valerion. "She's either going to revolutionize how this court works or get herself killed within a month." "Those aren't mutually exclusive," Valerion said. "She could do both." Encouraging. "I'm not here to encourage. I'm here to be realistic." After Meira left, Saris and Valerion stood alone in the council chamber. Morning light filtered through high windows, catching dust motes in the air. "Thank you," Saris said quietly. "For what?" "For taking me seriously. For giving me real power instead of just the appearance of it." "Don't thank me yet. You're about to discover that actual authority comes with actual weight, and the people who used to dismiss you will now actively work to undermine you." "I know." He moved closer, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. "I meant what I said last night, about needing time to think, but giving you this authority, that's me choosing a direction whether I finish thinking or not." "What direction?" "The one where you matter, where this is real, where I stop pretending that defending you was strategy, when we both know it was something else entirely." Saris felt her heart rate pick up. "And that terrifies you?" "Yes, but apparently not enough to stop me." He reached out, tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, in a gesture so casual and intimate it felt more dangerous than anything they'd done in public. "We're crossing lines we can't uncross," he said quietly. "I know. And once we're on the other side, there's no going back to pretending this is purely transactional. I know that too. Then we're both fools. Or we're both just human." He leaned his forehead against hers, standing there in the empty council chamber like they were the only two people in the world. "If this destroys us," he murmured, "if caring about each other becomes the weakness that brings everything down, I need you to know I chose it anyway." "So did I." They stood like that for a long moment, balanced on the edge of a transformation neither could prevent and both knew would change everything. Outside, the empire continued. Politics ground forward, enemies calculated, allies maneuvered. But in that moment, none of it mattered as much as the space between one breath and the next, the warmth of his skin against hers, the knowledge that they'd just committed to something far more dangerous than any political alliance. They'd committed to making it real. And there was no going back from that. The first 3 weeks of Saris's new authority passed in a blur of merchant meetings, contract negotiations, and late nights reviewing trade routes that hadn't been optimized in decades. She'd expected resistance. What she hadn't expected was how much of the actual work had been neglected by people more interested in collecting bribes than building functional systems. The merchant guilds were a mess. Overlapping jurisdictions, contradictory regulations, fees that existed purely to enrich whoever collected them. She started dismantling the worst of it, consolidating authority, eliminating redundant positions. Every change made enemies, but it also made the system work better. And people who profited from actual efficiency rather than corruption started to notice. Valerion watched from a distance, available when she needed backing, but letting her handle the details herself. They fell into a rhythm. Mornings apart, handling their separate responsibilities. Evenings together, reviewing the day's developments over dinner in his private study. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the space between strategic partners and something more genuine continued to narrow. She caught herself looking forward to those evenings, to the way he'd listen when she complained about particularly stubborn guildmasters, to his dry observations about court politics, to moments when their hands would brush reaching for the same document and neither would pull away immediately. It felt dangerous. It felt real. And neither seemed willing to name what was happening between them, as if speaking it aloud would make it vulnerable to forces they couldn't control. On a cold morning 4 weeks after the wedding that had changed everything, Saris sat in her office reviewing a proposal from the Eastern Port Authority when Meira appeared without knocking. The older woman's face was carefully neutral, which Saris had learned meant something was very wrong. "We have a problem," Meira said quietly, closing the door behind her. Saris set down the proposal. "What kind of problem?" "The kind where 3 separate sources reported the same concerning information within the last hour." Meira moved to the window, looking out over the courtyard. "There's been talk, among the noble houses. About the king's recent behavior. That's nothing new. There's always talk. Not like this. This is organized, coordinated. Someone's been systematically spreading the narrative that Varian has become compromised, that his attachment to you represents a fundamental weakness in leadership. Ceres felt ice settle in her stomach. Spreading it how? Carefully. Through trusted channels. Nothing direct enough to be called treason, but persistent enough that the message is landing. The king who once ruled through absolute control is now making emotional decisions. The empire that was built on ruthless calculation is now vulnerable to sentiment. And people are believing it. Some are. Enough that it's becoming a problem. Where's Varian? Meeting with General Kael and the other military commanders. They've been in there for over an hour. About what? Mira turned from the window, her expression grave. About whether the crown still has the full support of the military. The words hit like a physical blow. The military was the backbone of Varian's power. If the generals were questioning their loyalty, I need to see him, Ceres said, already standing. I don't think that's wise right now. I don't care what's wise. If they're using me as evidence of his weakness, I need to know what he's planning to do about it. Mira stepped in front of the door. Listen to me carefully. Right now, you walking into that meeting would confirm every accusation they're making. That you have undue influence. That he prioritizes your concerns over military strategy. Let him handle his generals, and if he can't, then we have bigger problems than your feelings. The bluntness stung, but Mira wasn't wrong. Ceres forced herself to sit back down, to return to her work, to pretend that her entire world wasn't potentially crumbling while she reviewed shipping manifests. 2 hours later, Varian appeared in her doorway. He looked exhausted. More than that, he looked shaken in a way she'd never seen before. We need to talk, he said. She dismissed the clerk she'd been working with and waited until they were alone. How bad is it? Varian moved to her desk, bracing his hands on the surface like he needed the support. Duke Torin has been building a coalition. Quietly, carefully, over the past month. He's convinced 4 major houses and at least 2 of my generals that my recent behavior represents a liability to imperial stability. What recent behavior specifically? Defending you at the wedding. Giving you genuine authority, spending time in your company that could be spent on governance. Everything that makes it clear you're not just a political convenience. So they want you to what? Cast me aside. They want me to demonstrate that I'm still capable of making decisions based purely on strategic value. That means proving you don't influence my judgment. How do you prove that? He met her eyes, and she saw something that looked like pain behind the calculation. By sacrificing you. The words hung in the air between them. Ceres felt her hands go numb. Explain. Torin's proposition is elegant. He's identified several trade contracts you've been negotiating. Legitimate deals that would benefit the Empire, but that happen to disadvantage houses aligned with him. He wants me to overrule your decisions, publicly, to make it clear that your authority exists only as long as it serves my purposes. And if you don't, then he'll move forward with a formal challenge to my fitness to rule. He has enough support to force a council vote. And if that vote goes against me, civil war, at minimum. More likely a fracturing of the empire into competing territories. Everything I've built, gone. Ceres stood, needing to move, to think. So your choice is humiliate me and keep your empire, or defend me and watch it collapse. That's what he's counting on. He's made the cost of attachment so high that the rational choice is obvious. She turned to face him. And what are you going to do? Varian's jaw tightened. I don't know. And the fact that I don't know immediately, that I'm even considering options beyond the strategically obvious, that's the proof he needs that he's right. That you're compromised. That I care about something more than pure power. Is that true? He moved around the desk to where she stood, close enough that she could see the conflict written across his face. Yes. And it's destroying me. Because everything I know about survival says sacrifice the peace to save the king, but everything I've become in the last month says that calculus doesn't work anymore. So we're back to the question you've been avoiding, whether you can be powerful and human at the same time. Apparently the answer is no. Because the moment I allowed myself to be human, my enemies found the weakness and drove straight for it. Ceres felt something crack inside her chest. All the careful walls she'd built, all the strategic distance she'd maintained suddenly felt impossibly fragile. What do you want me to say? she asked quietly. That I'll accept being humiliated if it keeps your empire intact. That I understand this was always temporary. That I knew what I was signing up for. I want you to tell me there's a third option I'm not seeing. There isn't. You know there isn't. Men like Torin don't make mistakes like leaving loopholes. He's backed you into a corner where every choice costs you something vital. Then help me figure out which cost I can actually survive. She looked at him. This man who'd given her power and protection, who defended her honor, who'd admitted that she mattered to him in ways that terrified them both. And she realized that love, real love, wasn't about grand gestures. It was about this. Standing in the wreckage of impossible choices and trying to find a path forward that didn't destroy everything. What happens if you refuse both options? She said slowly. What do you mean? If you don't publicly humiliate me, but you also don't let this go to a council vote, what if you just eliminate the threat entirely? Varion's eyes darkened. You're suggesting I have Torin killed. I'm suggesting you remind the Empire why challenging you is suicide. You've spent months proving you can be reasonable. Maybe it's time to prove you're still dangerous. That would confirm everything they're saying, that I'm making decisions based on emotion rather than strategy. Or it proves that threatening what's yours has consequences. That's not emotion, that's precedent. He was quiet for a long moment. If I go that route, there's no walking it back. It's a declaration that I will burn the Empire down before I let them take you from me. And that's the truth, isn't it? You've already decided. You're just afraid to commit to it. Yes. The admission was barely a whisper. Then stop being afraid. You've built this empire on being ruthless. Be ruthless now, even if it costs me everything I've worked for. It won't. Because the only people who'll stand against you are the ones who think you're weak. Show them you're not, and the rest will fall in line. And if they don't, then you'll know who your real enemies are, and you can deal with them accordingly. Varion reached out, cupped her face in his hands. You're asking me to start a purge. I'm asking you to survive. However that needs to happen. He kissed her then, not gentle, not strategic, desperate. Like she was air and he'd been drowning, like maybe they both had been drowning and only now realized it. When they broke apart, his forehead rested against hers. If I do this, he murmured, if I choose you over stability, you need to understand what that means. Every house that opposes me will come for you, directly, violently. You'll never be safe again. I haven't been safe since I agreed to marry you. At least this way we're unsafe together. That pulled a sound from him that was half laugh, half something broken. All right, he said. All right. We do this your way. What's my way? We make them regret ever thinking attachment was weakness. He pulled back, and she watched his expression shift. The vulnerability disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. The king returning. But this time, the king was choosing to protect something beyond just power. Summon the generals, he said. All of them. And get Mira. We're about to remind this court exactly who they're dealing with. Within the hour, the war room filled with military commanders, advisors, and the heads of major houses loyal to the crown. Varion stood at the head of the table, Ceres at his right hand, a deliberate positioning that made several attendees shift uncomfortably. Duke Torin arrived last, walking in with the confidence of a man who thought he held all the leverage. His eyes swept the room, calculating who was present and what that meant for his carefully constructed coalition. Varian waited until everyone was seated before speaking. It has come to my attention, he said, his voice carrying that particular quality that made everyone instinctively straighten, that there are concerns about my recent decisions, specifically about whether my attachment to the Queen represents a compromise to effective governance. Torin leaned forward slightly. Your Majesty, if I may— No, you may not. Varian's tone didn't rise, but something in it made the Duke freeze. You've been spreading poison for weeks now, whispering to my generals, cultivating doubt among houses that should know better, building a case that I've become weak, compromised, unfit to rule. The room had gone absolutely silent. So let me be very clear about something. My attachment to the Queen is not a weakness. It's a choice. And I am not a king who allows his choices to be questioned by subordinates seeking advantage. He moved around the table, approaching where Torin sat. You wanted to force me to prove I could still make ruthless decisions, to demonstrate that I value power over sentiment. Very well. Consider this your proof. He stopped directly behind Torin's chair. You are stripped of all titles, all lands, all authority. Your family's holdings revert to the crown. And you have until sunset to be outside my borders, or you'll discover exactly how creative I can be with execution methods. The color drained from Torin's face. Your Majesty, you can't— I am the king. There is nothing I cannot do, especially to traitors who think challenging the crown is a viable political strategy. But I have support, houses that will stand with me. Do you? Varian's gaze swept the room. Anyone in this room who aligned with Torin's little coalition has exactly one opportunity to reconsider, stand with him now, or pledge loyalty to the crown. Choose. Silence. Stretching. Suffocating. Then, one by one, every person Torin had supposedly rallied looked away, refused to meet his eyes, chose survival over solidarity. Torin's hands were shaking. This is tyranny. No. This is clarity. I have spent months proving I could be reasonable, measured, open to counsel, and you mistook that for weakness. So now I'm reminding you, reminding all of you, that I conquered an empire because I am very, very good at eliminating threats. He turned to the guard stationed at the door. Escort the former Duke Torin from this fortress. If he's still within Imperial borders by morning, kill him. The guards moved forward. Torin stood on shaking legs, his face a mask of disbelief and rage. This isn't over, he said. You think destroying me solves your problem. It doesn't. They're right about you. You have become weak, and eventually that weakness will— Varian moved faster than Saris had ever seen him move. One moment Torin was speaking, the next Varian had him by the throat, slammed against the wall hard enough to crack plaster. Eventually, Varian said, his voice deadly quiet, You will be a cautionary tale that parents tell their children about what happens when you mistake mercy for permission. Now get out of my sight before I decide exile is too generous. He released Torin, who stumbled and nearly fell. The guards grabbed him, dragged him toward the door. The former Duke cast one last look back, not at Varian, but at Saris, and in that look she saw pure hatred. The door slammed shut. Varian turned back to the assembled nobles and generals. Anyone else want to question whether the queen represents a weakness? No one spoke. Good. Because let me be absolutely clear. The queen has my full support. Her authority is my authority. Her decisions are my decisions. And anyone who thinks they can manipulate me by threatening her will discover that I am significantly more dangerous when I have something to protect than I ever was when I had nothing to lose. He returned to his position at the head of the table. Now, we have an empire to run, and all of you have positions to maintain. I suggest you focus on doing your jobs rather than testing my patience. Dismissed. They filed out in silence, moving with the cautious speed of people trying not to trigger a predator. Within minutes, the room was empty, except for Varian, Saris, and Mira. The moment the last person left, Varian's shoulders sagged. The iron control cracked, and Saris saw the toll that performance had taken. That was, Mira said carefully, quite the display. It was necessary. It was also exactly what Torin wanted. You've just confirmed that the Queen influences your decisions. No. Varian's voice was hard. I confirm that I will destroy anyone who threatens what's mine. That's not weakness. That's warning. Semantics. Reality. And now everyone knows where the line is. Mira studied them both, her expression unreadable. I hope you two understand what you've just committed to, because that wasn't a political maneuver. That was a declaration of war on anyone who opposes this union. Then we'll win the war, Saris said. You sound very certain. I'm not. But I'm committed, and apparently so is he. Varian looked at her, something softening in his expression, despite the hardness still present in his posture. I am, he said quietly. For better or worse? Mira shook her head. You're both idiots. Brave idiots, but idiots nonetheless. She moved toward the door, then paused. For what it's worth, that's the most human I've seen Varian in the 15 years I've served him. Maybe that's worth the risk. After she left, Saris and Varian stood alone in the war room, surrounded by maps of an empire that suddenly felt more fragile than it had that morning. Are you all right? Saris asked. No. He ran a hand through his hair. I just exiled one of the most powerful nobles in the empire because he threatened you. I've potentially destabilized relationships with half a dozen houses, and I don't regret it. That should terrify me. But it doesn't. It does. Just not enough to change what I did. She moved to him, took his hand. We'll handle whatever comes. Will we? Because Torhen was right about one thing. This isn't over. I've made an example of him, but that doesn't eliminate the underlying concern. If anything, I've proven their point. Then we prove a different point. That caring about something doesn't make you weak. It makes you more dangerous because now you have a reason to be ruthless. Is that what you are to me? A reason to be ruthless, among other things. What other things? She pulled him closer. A reason to believe there's more to life than strategic victories. A reason to think that maybe the cost of isolation is higher than the cost of connection. A reason to... The door burst open. A messenger stumbled in, face pale, breathing hard. Your Majesty, immediate report from the border. Varion's expression shifted instantly back to the controlled mask of kingship. Speak. Torren didn't go quietly. He stopped at the border garrison and rallied the troops stationed there. He's declared that you've been compromised and that he's acting to preserve the empire from a corrupted throne. How many troops? The entire border battalion, approximately 3,000 men. Saris felt the floor drop out from under her. He's staging a coup, she said. The messenger nodded. He's also sent word to the houses that were part of his coalition, calling them to honor their commitments, to stand with him against tyranny. And how many have responded? We don't know yet. But Your Majesty, there's more. Varion's jaw tightened. Say it. General Kyle rode out to meet Torren. We don't know if he's gone to suppress the rebellion or join it. The silence that followed was absolute. Kyle, one of Varion's most trusted generals, a man who'd served the crown for 20 years, either riding to put down a rebellion or riding to join it, and no one knew which. Summon the remaining generals, Varion said, his voice utterly empty of emotion. Full military mobilization. I want every loyal battalion ready to move within the hour. And if Kyle has joined Torren, then we fight a civil war, and we win it. The messenger bowed and ran. Saris stood frozen, watching the consequences of their choice cascade into reality. This is my fault, she said quietly. No. If I hadn't pushed you to choose me over stability. You think I didn't know this was a possibility? Varion turned to face her fully. The moment I decided you mattered, I accepted that it might cost me everything. That calculation was mine, not yours. But no. Listen to me. He grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to meet his eyes. Whatever happens now, whatever we have to fight through, that's not on you. Torren made his choice. Kyle is making his, and I made mine. We all own our decisions, even if your decision destroys your empire, especially then. Outside, she could hear the fortress coming alive. Soldiers mobilizing, horses being saddled, the machinery of war grinding into motion. Varion, what if we lose? Then we lose together. But I will not apologize for refusing to sacrifice you. Not to them, not to anyone. He pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the only solid thing in a world that had started to crumble. I need you to do something for me, he said into her hair. Anything. Survive. Whatever happens in the next days or weeks, whatever I have to do to put this down, I need you to survive it. You're not going alone. Yes, I am. You stay here, protected by the fortress guard. I take the military and end this before it spreads. Absolutely not. It's not a debate. He pulled back to look at her. You're the queen. If I fall, the empire needs continuity. That's you. But more than that, I can't fight effectively if I'm worried about keeping you safe on a battlefield. So I just wait here, hoping you come back. You do more than wait. You hold this fortress, maintain the government, show the empire that we're not in chaos. Be the strength I need you to be. She wanted to argue, wanted to demand he let her fight beside him, but she could see the logic, could see that splitting his focus between military strategy and her safety would get them both killed. Fine. But you come back to me. I will. Promise. He kissed her, slow, thorough, like he was memorizing the taste of her. I promise. It was a lie. They both knew it was a lie. Because on a battlefield, promises meant nothing against arrows and swords and the chaos of men trying to kill each other, but she let him say it anyway. Within 2 hours, Varion rode out at the head of 5,000 soldiers. Cerys watched from the battlements as the column disappeared into the distance, carrying with it the man who'd become everything she'd never known she needed. Mira appeared beside her. He'll come back. You don't know that. No. But I know Varion. And I know he's never been more motivated to win a fight in his life. Because of me. Because he finally has something worth coming home to. They stood in silence, watching the empty road. What do I do now? Cerys asked. Now, you rule. Because that's what queens do when their kings go to war. Over the next 3 days, Cerys learned what it meant to hold power in the absence of the person everyone really feared. Nobles who'd been deferential became testing. Advisors who'd accepted her authority started questioning her decisions. The vultures circled, seeing opportunity in Varion's absence. She crushed them, one by one, with the same ruthless efficiency she'd watched Varion employ. She had disloyal advisors removed from their positions. She made examples of nobles who thought her authority was temporary. She showed them that the queen was not decoration waiting for the king to return. Reports from the border came in fragmentary and contradictory. Torrhen's forces had grown. Some said to 5,000, others claimed 10. Kyle had joined the rebellion. No, Kyle was still loyal. There had been a battle. No, both sides were still maneuvering for position. The uncertainty was torture. On the 4th night, Mira found Cerys in the war room staring at maps and trying not to imagine all the ways this could end in disaster. You need to sleep. I need to know if my husband is alive. The word hung in the air. Husband. When had she started thinking of him that way? Mira sat beside her. He's alive. I'd feel it if he wasn't. That's not how it works. Isn't it? When you love someone, when they become part of you, you know, deep down. And I don't feel that void yet. Cerys looked at the older woman. You loved someone. In Varion's father's army. Mira was quiet for a long moment. I did. And I felt it when he died. Like something being ripped out of my chest. So trust me when I say, Varion is still out there. How do you survive it? Loving someone who might die at any moment. You don't survive, you just keep breathing and hope that's enough. Before Cerys could respond, the doors burst open. A messenger, covered in road dust and blood. Your Majesty. From the king. She was on her feet instantly. Is he? He's alive. But you need to read this. Now. The messenger handed her a sealed letter. Varion's seal, his handwriting. She broke it open with shaking hands. Cerys read. Then read again. Then looked up at Mira with something between horror and disbelief. He's won. Torrhen is dead. Kyle remained loyal. The rebellion is broken. Then why do you look like that? Because there's a condition. For the surrender of Torrhen's remaining forces and the houses that backed him. What condition? They want me gone. Not dead. Just removed from power. Exiled. Made irrelevant. That's the price for peace. And Varion says he's coming home to discuss options, but I can read between the lines. He's going to try to convince me that accepting exile is the right choice, that saving the Empire requires my sacrifice after all. Mira's expression went hard. And what are you going to tell him? Cerys looked down at the letter, at Varion's handwriting, at the carefully phrased diplomatic language that couldn't hide what he was really asking. I'm going to tell him no. That we don't negotiate with people who think they can use me as leverage. That if he wants me gone, he'll have to do it himself, and we'll both know what that means. It means the war continues. Then it continues. Because I'm done being the piece everyone thinks they can sacrifice to get what they want, even if Varion asks you to go. Especially then. Because if he's willing to sacrifice me after everything we've been through, then he was never really committed to choosing humanity over power. And I need to know which man is coming home. She folded the letter carefully. Send word that the Queen awaits the King's return, and that we will discuss terms when he arrives. Not before. The messenger bowed and left. Cerys stood alone with Mira in the war room, surrounded by maps of an empire that might tear itself apart before dawn. You're gambling everything on him choosing you, Mara said quietly. I'm giving him the chance to prove whether his promise meant anything, whether caring about me was real or just another strategic phase. And if he chooses the Empire, then I'll know what I really am to him. A weakness to be eliminated when it becomes inconvenient. She moved to the window, looking out at the fortress she'd learned to defend, the power she'd learned to wield, the life she'd built on the foundation of one desperate gamble. But I don't think he will. I think he'll come home, and he'll rage about impossible choices, and he'll try to logic his way into convincing me that exile is rational. And then I'll remind him that love isn't rational, that choosing me over peace isn't weakness, and that the man who defended me in a wedding hall and exiled a duke for threatening me doesn't get to suddenly decide I'm disposable when the cost gets higher. You sound certain. I'm not. But I'm committed to finding out who he really is beneath all the strategy and control. The dawn came cold and gray. Ceres stood on the battlements watching the road, waiting for the column that would bring Valerion home, waiting to discover whether the man who returned was the one who'd promised to choose her, or the king who'd learned that some costs were simply too high. Either way, everything was about to change, and there was no going back from what came next. The column appeared on the horizon just after dawn, moving with the deliberate pace of soldiers who'd seen too much death to rush toward anything resembling rest. Ceres counted the banners from her position on the battlements. Fewer than had left, but more than she'd feared. Varyon's standard flew at the head of the formation, intact and defiant against the gray morning sky. He was alive. Everything else could be dealt with. But that single fact, that he'd survived, that he was coming home, loosened something in her chest that had been locked tight for days. Mira appeared beside her, scanning the approaching force with the practiced eye of someone who'd watched too many armies return from too many battles. They look like hell, she observed. They look like they won, Ceres corrected. Winning and looking like hell aren't mutually exclusive, especially when the cost was high. The gates opened as the column reached the fortress. Soldiers filed through, moving with the exhausted precision of men who'd been pushed to their limits and somehow found reserve beyond that. She saw bandaged limbs, blood-stained armor, faces that held the hollowed-out expression of people who'd killed and watched friends die and couldn't quite process either yet. And at the center of it all, Valerion dismounted with the controlled movements of someone managing pain they refused to acknowledge. His armor was dented. Dried blood streaked across the dark metal. Whether his or someone else's, she couldn't tell from this distance. But he was upright, moving, alive. Their eyes met across the courtyard. Even from here, she could see the conflict written across his features. Relief, exhaustion, and something that looked almost like dread. He knew what conversation was coming, knew she'd received his letter, knew that the easy victory of crushing Tauren's rebellion had been purchased at a price neither of them wanted to pay. Ceres descended from the battlements, moving through corridors that had become familiar in his absence. By the time she reached the entrance hall, Valerion was there, stripping off gauntlets with hands that moved just slightly too carefully. Injured then, but functional. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing. Let me see." "Later." He didn't look at her. "First, I need to debrief the council. Get casualty counts. Secure the—" "Valerion." He finally met her eyes, and what she saw there made her heart clench. This wasn't the controlled king who'd ridden out to war. This was a man who'd been forced to make choices that were destroying him from the inside and couldn't figure out how to stop the bleeding. "Later," he repeated quietly. "Please." She wanted to push, wanted to demand they have the conversation now, while everything was raw and real. But she'd learned enough about command to recognize when someone was holding themselves together through pure force of will. Push now, and he'd shatter. And whatever pieces remained wouldn't be capable of the discussion they needed to have. "All right," she said. "Later." Relief flickered across his face, quickly suppressed. "Thank you." He moved past her toward the council chambers, every step controlled despite obvious pain. Mira appeared from the shadows, watching him go with an expression Ceres couldn't quite read. "That man is barely standing," the advisor said quietly. "I know. And he's about to try to convince you to sacrifice yourself for the Empire." "I know that too. What are you going to do?" Ceres turned to watch Valerion's retreating form disappear around a corner. I'm going to give him exactly one chance to be the man who promised to choose me. And if he can't do that, I'll know everything I need to know about what I really am to him. The hours that followed moved with agonizing slowness. Ceres returned to her duties, processing trade reports and merchant complaints that felt absurdly trivial compared to soldiers dying on battlefields. But this was her role now: keep the machinery of empire functioning while others handled the violence. Reports filtered through as the day progressed. Torin had died in the initial engagement, cut down by Kael himself in what witnesses described as a brutal duel. The houses that had backed the rebellion were suing for peace, offering substantial concessions in exchange for clemency. The empire was wounded, but intact. Except for the one condition they all demanded before finalizing surrender: remove the queen. Prove she doesn't control the king's judgment. Demonstrate that strategy still outweighs sentiment. It was elegant, really. They couldn't beat Varian militarily, so they'd found the one weakness they could exploit. Make keeping Ceres cost more than losing her. Force the calculation that would prove their point regardless of which option he chose. As twilight painted the sky in shades of blood and ash, a servant appeared to inform Ceres that the king requested her presence in his private chambers. The confrontation she'd been preparing for all day was finally here. She found him standing at the window, still in the same blood-stained armor, staring out at the fortress grounds like he could see through stone to something beyond. A bottle of wine sat on the desk, half empty, though he didn't appear drunk, just tired in a way that went deeper than physical exhaustion. "You should have that wound looked at," she said, closing the door behind her. "I told you. It's nothing." "Varian, it's a cracked rib, maybe two." The field surgeon wrapped them. "They'll heal, unless they puncture something vital." "They won't." She moved to where he stood, close enough to see the gray threading through his dark hair, the new scar across his cheekbone. The way his jaw was locked against pain he refused to show. "How many did you lose?" she asked quietly. 473. He said it with the flat precision of someone who'd counted every single one, plus another 200 wounded badly enough they won't fight again. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." They died doing exactly what soldiers are supposed to do, preserving the empire. The waste would be if their sacrifice achieved nothing. There it was, the opening to the conversation they'd been circling. And what did their sacrifice achieve, she asked. Silence, stretching, suffocating. Then he turned to face her fully, and she saw that the conflict in his expression had resolved into something that looked almost like resignation. The rebel houses are offering complete surrender, full restitution for damages, acknowledgement of crown authority. Everything we'd need to restore stability and prevent this from happening again. In exchange for, you know what they want, say it anyway. They want you removed from power, not harmed, not imprisoned, just exiled to a comfortable estate somewhere distant where you can live out your life in peace and obscurity. And you're considering it. Something flashed in his eyes. Anger, maybe, or pain. I'm considering everything. That's what being a king means. Weighing all options regardless of personal cost. Personal cost. She felt heat rising in her chest. Is that what I am to you now? A personal cost to be calculated against strategic benefit. You know that's not... Then what? What am I if not the woman you promised to choose? The one you said mattered more than pure strategy. You do matter. But so do the 473 soldiers who died fighting a rebellion that exists because I chose you over stability. So do the thousands more who'll die if this conflict continues because I'm too stubborn to accept the obvious solution. The obvious solution being my exile. Yes. The word landed like a physical blow. She'd known it was coming, had prepared for this exact moment, but hearing him actually say it felt like being gutted. So that's it, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Everything you said about caring, about not being able to pretend this was transactional, about defending me because I mattered, not because of strategy. All of it was just words. No. All of it was real. All of it still is. Then how can you stand there and tell me the obvious solution is throwing me away? Because keeping you means more death, more instability, more soldiers dying to preserve my personal happiness. And I can't... He stopped, turned back to the window. When he spoke again, his voice was raw. I can't be responsible for burning the empire down just because I fell in love with you. The admission hung in the air between them, the first time either had said it directly. Love. Not attachment, not caring. Love. And somehow that made it worse. You think love is weakness, Sarah said. You think choosing me over peace proves they were right about you being compromised. But you're wrong. Am I? Because from where I stand, every argument for keeping you is emotional, and every argument for letting you go is rational. That's the definition of compromised judgment. No. That's the definition of being human, of having priorities beyond pure tactical advantage, of understanding that some things are worth fighting for even when the cost is high. She moved to stand directly in front of him, forcing him to look at her. You want to talk about soldiers dying? Fine. They died because Torin was a traitor who chose rebellion over loyalty. Because houses that should have known better decided testing your authority was worth the risk. That's on them. Not on me. Not on you for refusing to sacrifice me. The logic doesn't change the body count. Then let's talk about what happens if you send me away. You think the vultures will stop circling. You think proving you can make the hard choice will buy you peace. It won't. It'll show them that you can be manipulated, that threatening something you care about works, so they'll find the next thing you value and use it the same way. I won't let myself value anything else. You can't control that. You already proved it. You spent years convincing yourself that isolation was strength, and then I walked into your throne hall and everything changed. You think you can just shut that off, go back to being the cold calculator who doesn't care about anything. I have to try. Why? Because being human is inconvenient, because caring makes you vulnerable, because loving someone means risking exactly this kind of pain. Yes. She grabbed his face in both hands, forcing him to hold her gaze. Then let me tell you something about pain. I know what it feels like to be destroyed by people who claim to care, to be used and discarded when I stopped being useful. And when you promised you wouldn't do that, when you defended me and gave me power and admitted I mattered, I started to believe that maybe I'd finally found someone who saw me as more than a strategic asset. Ceres. Maikiu isa setiti eats. I'm not finished. If you send me away now, you're proving you're exactly like Aldrich, exactly like everyone who decided I was disposable when the cost of keeping me got too high. And you'll have to live with that, with knowing you became the thing you promised to protect me from. She released him, stepped back. So here's my answer to your obvious solution. No. I'm not going quietly into exile so you can pretend this never happened. If you want me gone, you'll have to order it directly. Look me in the eyes and tell me I'm not worth the cost, and we'll both know exactly what that means about every promise you made. Varion's hands were shaking. Actually, shaking. She watched him fight for control, watched emotions war across his face in a way he'd never allowed before. You're asking me to choose between you and the Empire. I'm asking you to be the man who told me attachment wasn't weakness, who said caring made you more dangerous, not less, who promised that defending me wasn't strategy but choice. That was before I knew the cost. The cost was always going to be high. That's what makes it a choice instead of convenience. She moved to the desk, poured wine into 2 glasses with hands that were steadier than they had any right to be. Here's what I think. I think you're terrified. Not of losing the Empire, not of more soldiers dying. You're terrified that loving me makes you vulnerable in a way you can't control, that it proves you're not the invincible force you spent years becoming, and sending me away is easier than admitting you're human. She handed him one of the glasses. But being human isn't weakness. Loving someone isn't compromise. And the moment you accept exile as the price of peace, you prove that everything you built was just an elaborate prison where you locked yourself away from ever risking anything real. Varion took the glass but didn't drink, just stared at the dark liquid like it held answers he couldn't find anywhere else. What if you're wrong? He said quietly. What if choosing you does destroy everything? What if I'm not strong enough to protect both you and the Empire? Then we find out together, but we don't preemptively surrender because the fight looks hard. 473 soldiers died fighting for their king, not for my exile. They'd be furious if they knew you were even considering giving in to exactly what Torin wanted. You can't know that. I can, because I've read the reports. I've talked to the wounded. I know what they think they were fighting for. And it wasn't the right to watch their king cave to political pressure. She set her glass down, moved back to where he stood. Varion, Look at me. He did. Those dark eyes that had seen too much, that held too many calculations and not enough mercy for the man behind them. You told me once that kings don't get luxuries, that loneliness is weakness, that caring makes you vulnerable. And I've watched you live that philosophy, watched it hollow you out, turn you into someone who could rule an empire but couldn't remember why ruling mattered. I remember why. Do you? Or have you just convinced yourself that power for its own sake is enough? That control is the same as purpose? That winning is the same as living? What's your point? My point is that defending me at that wedding, fighting for me despite the cost, that was the first time I saw you actually alive. Not just existing, not just calculating, alive. And if you think I'm going to let you go back to being the hollow shell who sat on that throne before I walked in, you're wrong. He set down his glass with enough force to crack it. Wine bled across the desk like a wound. You're asking me to risk everything. I'm asking you to fight for something that matters. For someone who sees you as more than a crown. For a future where power and humanity aren't mutually exclusive. And if I can't, if the cost genuinely is too high, then I'll know, and I'll leave. But not because you ordered it, because I chose to, because I won't stay with someone who sees me as a liability instead of a partner. His control finally shattered. He pulled her against him with enough force to hurt, buried his face in her hair, and she felt him shaking. I don't know how to do this, he said, the words muffled and broken. I don't know how to be both, how to rule and love and not have one destroy the other. She wrapped her arms around him, held him while he fell apart in the privacy of his chambers, where no one could see the king reduced to just a man who'd realized he'd been asked to choose between survival and living. Then we figure it out together, she said. We make mistakes. We pay costs neither of us wanted. We fight battles on fronts we didn't expect. But we do it together. What if it's not enough? Then at least we tried. At least we chose to be human instead of machines calculating advantage. They stood like that for a long time. Two people holding each other while the weight of an empire pressed down and tried to crush whatever fragile thing they'd built between them. Finally, Varian pulled back. His eyes were red-rimmed, his face haggard, but something had changed in his expression. The resignation was gone. In its place was something that looked almost like determination. All right, he said. All right. We do this your way. What's my way? We reject their terms. We tell the rebel houses that the queen stays and they can accept that or face consequences. We make it clear that using you as leverage was a catastrophic miscalculation. And when they refuse, when they rally more support and this turns into prolonged conflict, then we fight and we win. Because I'm done pretending that ruling effectively requires me to sacrifice everything I care about. She searched his face, looking for doubt, for the calculation that would betray this as another strategic move. But all she saw was exhaustion and determination and something that looked terrifyingly close to hope. You're sure? No, but I'm committed. There's a difference. He moved to the desk, pulled out parchment, began writing with swift, angry strokes. What are you doing? She asked. Drafting a response to their surrender terms, rejecting exile, offering them one opportunity to swear fealty without conditions or face systematic elimination of their houses. That's brutal. That's clarity. They wanted to test whether I'd choose you over stability. Now they get their answer, and they get to live with the consequences. He finished writing, sealed the document, moved toward the door to summon a messenger. But Saris caught his arm. Wait. What? Before you send that. Before we commit to this path. I need you to understand what you're really choosing. I know what I'm choosing. Do you? Because this isn't just about keeping me around. It's about fundamentally changing how you rule. About accepting that caring makes you different, not weaker. About building something that doesn't require you to be invulnerable. I understand. And if it fails, if we can't make this work, if the cost genuinely does become too high, then we fail together. But we try first. She looked at him, this man who'd been shaped by loss and hardened by necessity, who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to be vulnerable, who was now choosing to tear those walls down because she'd asked him to remember he was human. Okay, she said. Okay. Send it. He opened the door, handed the message to the guard outside with instructions to deliver it immediately to the waiting emissaries. Then he closed the door and turned back to her. Now what? He asked. Now we prepare for war. Real war. Because they're not going to accept this peacefully. I know. And we do it knowing that we chose this. That we could have had peace and rejected it because the price was too high. We rejected it because some things are worth more than peace. She moved to him, took his hands. Are you going to regret this? When soldiers die, when houses rebel, when everything you built starts to crack? Probably, but I'd regret the alternative more. Outside, night had fallen completely. The fortress was quiet, except for the ever-present sound of guards changing shifts, horses in the stable, the endless machinery of an empire that never truly slept. Somewhere beyond these walls, emissaries were receiving a message that would change everything. A declaration that the king would not be manipulated, that the queen was untouchable, that anyone who thought attachment was weakness was about to learn exactly how dangerous a man could become when he had something worth protecting. The response came faster than expected. Before dawn, a messenger arrived bearing news that made Ceres's blood run cold. The rebel houses had rejected the terms. More than that, they'd used Varian's refusal to exile her as proof of compromised judgment and were calling for a formal council to consider his fitness to rule. 3 major houses that had been neutral were now backing the motion. The military was split, with generals taking sides based on whether they believed the king or the crown mattered more. Varian read the report in the pre-dawn darkness of the war room, surrounded by maps and tactical assessments that suddenly felt inadequate for the scope of what was coming. It's a coup, Mira said bluntly, dressed up in legal language, but that's what this is. They're trying to remove you from power. Let them try. Varian's voice was hard. I've crushed better organized rebellions. Not when half your own council is questioning your judgment. Not when generals you've relied on for years are choosing institutional stability over personal loyalty. Then we remind them why personal loyalty to me is the only rational choice. By doing what exactly? Mira moved closer. You can't execute everyone who opposes you. That's not strength. That's paranoia. And it confirms everything they're saying about you being compromised. Ceres had been quiet, processing the implications. Now she spoke. They're not trying to remove Valerian. They're trying to remove both of us. If they succeed in deposing him, I'm gone anyway, so we're already fighting for everything. Exactly, Valerian said, which means we have nothing left to lose. That's not a strategy. That's desperation. Desperation can be remarkably clarifying. He turned to face them both. Here's what we do. We call the council. We let them make their case. And then I demonstrate exactly why questioning my fitness to rule is the worst mistake they could possibly make. How? By proving I'm still the most dangerous man in this empire, and that choosing humanity over isolation didn't make me weak. It made me more ruthless because now I have a reason to be. Mira looked between them. You're both insane. Possibly. But we're committed. The council convened 3 days later in the Great Hall of Nightfall Bastion. Every major house sent representatives. Every general of note attended. The chamber filled with nobles and military commanders and advisors who'd gathered to witness what many assumed would be the end of Valerian Thorn's reign. Ceres stood beside his throne, not behind it, not separate from it, but beside it in a positioning that made their unity unmistakable. She wore dark crimson again, the color that had become her signature. Varian's mother's ring caught the light every time she moved her hand. Lord Vastus, the highest-ranking noble among those calling for review, stood to present the case. Your Majesty, he began, with the kind of false courtesy that barely concealed contempt. We come before you not as enemies, but as loyal servants concerned for the future of the empire. Concern noted. Varian's tone was bored. Present your case or sit down. Vastus's jaw tightened. Very well. Over the past months, we have observed troubling changes in your decision-making. The exile of Duke Torin without proper trial. The elevation of the Queen to positions of genuine authority without council input. The rejection of reasonable terms that would have ended rebellion and preserved stability. These actions suggest judgment compromised by personal attachment. Compromised, Varian repeated. Interesting word choice. Define it for me. You have placed the desires of one woman above the needs of the empire. You have chosen sentiment over strategy. You have demonstrated that your attachment to the Queen represents a fundamental weakness in leadership. I see. And the alternative you're proposing is what, exactly? Vastus glanced at his allies before continuing. The queen should be removed from positions of authority and encouraged to retire to a comfortable but distant estate. This would demonstrate your ability to make difficult decisions in service of imperial stability. Encouraged. Such a diplomatic term for exile. We prefer to think of it as, I don't care what you prefer to think of it as. Varian stood. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. You're asking me to prove I'm fit to rule by destroying the woman I love. You've dressed it in the language of stability and imperial needs, but let's be clear about what you're really doing. You're testing whether you can control me through threats. Your Majesty, I'm not finished. He descended from the dais, moving toward where Vastus stood. You think my attachment to the queen is weakness. You think caring about her makes me vulnerable to manipulation. So let me correct that misunderstanding right now. He stopped directly in front of Vastus. Before I met her, I ruled through fear and calculation. I was efficient, I was ruthless, I was also hollow. The empire was stable because I had nothing to lose, which meant I could sacrifice anything without hesitation. You saw that as strength. He turned, addressing the entire chamber. But here's what you failed to understand. A man with nothing to lose is predictable. You know exactly what motivates him, power for its own sake. You can work with that, anticipate it, potentially manipulate it. His voice hardened. A man defending something he loves is unpredictable. You don't know where his lines are because he's never revealed them. You don't know what he'll risk because the calculation isn't purely strategic anymore. And you definitely don't know how creative he'll become when you threaten what matters to him. The chamber had gone absolutely silent. So when you gathered here to question my fitness to rule, you made a fundamental error. You assumed that caring made me weaker. It didn't. It made me vastly more dangerous. Because now I'm not just preserving power. I'm protecting something that matters more than power ever could. He turned back to Vastus. You want me to prove I can make hard decisions? Fine. Here's a hard decision. Everyone in this chamber who supports removing the queen has exactly one opportunity to recant. Do it now, publicly, and we continue as if this conversation never happened. The silence stretched. No one, Varian continued, his voice dropping to something deadly quiet. Interesting. Then let me make another hard decision. He moved back to the throne, Cerys watching every calculated step. Anyone who votes to remove the queen from her position is committing treason, not against me personally, against the crown itself, because the queen's authority is my authority. Questioning hers is questioning mine, and the penalty for treason is death. Your Majesty, you cannot. I am the king. There is very little I cannot do. And what I'm telling you right now is that if you proceed with this vote, you're not testing my judgment. You're signing your own execution orders. Vastus had gone pale. This is tyranny. No. This is clarity. You wanted to know if I could still make ruthless decisions. I just did. The only question now is whether you're brave enough to test whether I meant it. The nobles exchanged glances. Calculations shifting. Risk assessment happening in real time across dozens of faces. Then General Kyle stood, the man who'd remained loyal through the rebellion, whose support had been crucial to victory. Your Majesty, he said carefully, if I may, speak. I understand your position. Truly. But threatening the council with execution if they vote against you, that's not strength. That's fear. Is it? Valerian's gaze locked onto Kyle. Or is it a king making clear that some lines cannot be crossed? That attacking my queen means attacking me? That I will burn this empire to bedrock before I let anyone use her as leverage against me? Even if that destroys everything you've built, especially then, because what I've built means nothing if it requires me to be hollow to maintain it. He turned to address the full chamber again. I spent years believing that power demanded isolation, that caring was weakness, that a ruler had to sacrifice everything personal to be effective, and you all benefited from that belief. From a king who made decisions with cold calculation and no emotional investment. His voice rose. But that king was dying inside, becoming something less than human in service of an idea of strength that was really just elaborate cowardice. The queen didn't compromise my judgment. She reminded me I had judgment worth defending. She showed me that ruling can mean something more than just accumulating and maintaining power. He sat back on the throne, pulling Ceres down to sit on the arm of it, a casual intimacy that made several council members flinch. So here's your choice. Accept that I'm capable of being both effective and human, that I can love her and still rule effectively. Or continue down this path and discover exactly how ruthless I become when you threaten what I've chosen to protect. Accept the new reality or face consequences. That's the decision before you. Make it wisely. The chamber erupted. Nobles arguing with each other, generals conferring in urgent whispers. The carefully constructed coalition fracturing as people reassessed the cost of opposition versus the cost of acquiescence. Ceres watched it all from her position beside the throne, Varion's hand covering hers in a grip that was probably too tight, but she didn't pull away. They'd gambled everything on this moment, on whether his willingness to fight for her would inspire loyalty or confirm every accusation of compromised judgment. Finally, Lord Vastus stood again. His face had the expression of a man who'd just realized he'd miscalculated badly. "Your Majesty," he said, the words clearly costing him, "perhaps we have been too hasty in our concerns. The Queen has demonstrated competence in her assigned duties, and if you believe her presence strengthens rather than weakens the crown, then we defer to your judgment." It was a surrender. Careful. Qualified. But a surrender nonetheless. Varion didn't smile. Anyone else want to express concerns about the Queen's position? Silence. Good. Then this council is concluded. You're all dismissed. They filed out like whipped dogs, conversations starting the moment they were out of immediate earshot. Calculations already shifting to accommodate this new reality. A king who'd proven he would risk everything to protect someone he loved. When the chamber was finally empty except for Ceres, Varion, and Mira, the king's carefully maintained control finally cracked. He slumped forward, elbows on knees, breathing like he'd just run miles. "That was insane," Mira said. "Utterly insane." "Did it work?" he asked without looking up. "For now. But you just made a lot of powerful enemies. I already had powerful enemies. Now they know the cost of acting on it." Ceres moved to kneel in front of him, taking his face in her hands. "You chose me," she said quietly. "I did. Even knowing it might cost you everything. Especially knowing that. Because what's the point of having everything if I lose myself maintaining it?" She kissed him. Soft. Grateful. Terrified by what they'd just committed to. When they broke apart, Mira was watching them with an expression that might have been approval or might have been resignation to inevitable disaster. "You two understand this isn't over," she said. "Vastus surrendered because the immediate cost of opposition was too high. But he'll be back, they all will. They'll just be more careful next time." "Then we'll be ready next time," Varian said. "Will you? Because you just declared war on political manipulation by threatening everyone who opposes you. That's not sustainable. It doesn't have to be sustainable forever, just long enough to establish that the Queen is untouchable. And how long is that? As long as it takes." Mira shook her head, but there was something like fondness in the gesture. "You're both idiots. Brave, committed idiots, but idiots nonetheless." After she left, Ceres and Varion sat in the empty chamber surrounded by the echoes of a confrontation that had rewritten the rules of power in the Empire. "We crossed a line today," Ceres said. "Several of them. There's no going back to how things were." "No, there's not. Are you afraid?" Varion pulled her into his lap, held her like she was the only real thing in a world built on calculation and threat. "Terrified," he admitted. "But also more certain than I've been about anything in years. Whatever happens now, we face it together. Together. Together." Outside, the sun was setting over Nightfall Bastion, painting the stones in shades of blood and gold. Somewhere beyond the walls, enemies were regrouping, plotting, calculating new approaches to the problem of a king who'd proven he would sacrifice anything except the woman he loved. And in the Great Hall, two people sat holding each other while the weight of their choices settled around them like armor they'd have to wear into every battle that came next. They'd won today. Forced surrender through threat and determination and refusal to accept the obvious solution. But both knew the truth that Mira had spoken. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. And the real test, the one that would determine whether love and power could coexist or would destroy each other, was still coming. The weeks following the council confrontation felt like living on a knife's edge. Varion had forced surrender through threat and will, but everyone knew the foundation was fragile. Houses that had bent the knee in that chamber went home to recalculate, to find new angles of attack that didn't involve direct opposition. The game had changed, but the game never truly ended. Ceres threw herself into her work with renewed intensity. If she was going to be the reason the Empire teetered on instability, she'd damn well make sure her contributions were undeniable. Trade routes were optimized, merchant guilds were restructured, port authorities that had been corrupt for generations found themselves either reformed or replaced. The economy strengthened in ways that even her harshest critics couldn't dismiss. But strength in governance couldn't eliminate the underlying tension. She felt it in the way certain nobles looked at her during court functions, calculation behind polite smiles, assessment behind courteous bows. They were waiting for her to fail, for Varion to falter, for the relationship to crack under pressure and prove what they'd always believed about sentiment being weakness. On a cold morning, 6 weeks after the council, Mira appeared in Ceres's office with an expression that had become familiar, the one that meant another problem had surfaced. Lord Vastus is requesting a private audience, the advisor said without preamble. With me or Valerion? You. Specifically. He says it's a matter that requires the Queen's personal attention. Ceres set down the contract she'd been reviewing. That's either a peace offering or a trap. Probably both. Do you want me to refuse it? She considered. Vastus had been quiet since his surrender in the council chamber. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that meant someone was either licking wounds or sharpening knives. No, she said finally, I'll meet with him, but have guards nearby, and make sure Varion knows. Already done. He's not happy about it. He doesn't have to be happy. He just has to trust my judgment. Mira's expression softened fractionally. He does. That's what terrifies him. Vastus arrived precisely on time, moving with the careful dignity of old nobility that had learned to mask calculation behind courtly manners. He was perhaps 60, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing the kind of expensive simplicity that announced wealth without ostentation. Your Majesty, he said, bowing with exactly the correct depth. Thank you for agreeing to see me. Lord Vastus. Please, sit. They settled into chairs positioned across from each other in what was ostensibly a casual arrangement but both knew was really a negotiating table by another name. I'll be direct, Vastus said. I came to apologize. Ceres kept her expression neutral despite surprise. For what specifically? For underestimating you. For assuming you were simply a convenient political piece the king had elevated without thought. For believing that your position represented weakness rather than strength. And what changed your mind? The trade reforms you've implemented over the past month, the way you've navigated merchant guild politics, the economic data that suggests the empire is actually more stable now than it was before your elevation. He leaned forward slightly. I built my opposition on the assumption that you were decoration, a distraction that compromised the king's effectiveness. But the numbers don't support that narrative. If anything, having someone competent managing aspects of governance the king never prioritized has made the empire stronger. So this is a practical reassessment, not a moral one. I'm a noble, Your Majesty. Practical reassessments are the closest we get to moral positions. Despite herself, Ceres felt a grudging respect for the honesty. What do you want, Lord Vastus? To propose a truce? I stop working to undermine your position. You consider me an ally rather than an enemy. We both benefit from stability. And in exchange, I want assurance that the king's attachment to you won't lead to reckless decisions that destabilize the empire, that you'll serve as a moderating influence rather than encouraging his worst impulses. You want me to control him. I want you to balance him. There's a difference. Ceres studied the man across from her, trying to read intent behind diplomatic language. Why should I believe this isn't just another angle of attack? Because I'm too old and too practical to waste time on elaborate deceptions. The king made clear what happens to people who threaten you. I'm choosing survival over pride, but I'm also choosing something I believe serves the empire. You're competent, you care about governance, and you seem to understand that loving the king doesn't mean enabling his every decision. What decisions are you concerned about? The ones where emotion overrides strategy, where defending you takes priority over preserving imperial stability. I understand why he does it. I even respect it on some level. But someone needs to be positioned to advise caution when necessary. And you think that's me? I think you're the only person he'd actually listen to. Saris was quiet for a long moment, processing implications. What Vastus was proposing was subtle, not open opposition, but a framework where she became responsible for managing Varion's more extreme impulses. It was elegant. It gave Vastus influence without appearing to challenge the king, and it put weight on her shoulders that she wasn't certain she wanted. "I'll consider your proposal," she said finally, "but understand something clearly. I won't betray Varion's trust by second-guessing his decisions behind his back. If I have concerns, I raise them with him directly. Whatever influence I have comes from honesty, not manipulation. I wouldn't expect anything less. And if you're looking for a lever to control him through me, you're going to be disappointed." Vastus smiled thinly. "Your Majesty, if I wanted a lever, I'd have approached differently. What I want is stability. And I've realized that stability with you is more achievable than stability without you. That's the entirety of my calculation." He stood, bowed again. "Think about it. And if you decide a truce serves your purposes, you know where to find me." After he left, Ceres sat alone in her office, trying to decide if she'd just been outmaneuvered or offered a genuine opportunity. The problem with court politics was that the two were often indistinguishable until it was too late. That evening, she found Varion in his private study, surrounded by military reports, and looking like he'd aged a decade in the weeks since the council confrontation. The cost of forcing loyalty through threat was constant vigilance. Every house had to be watched. Every general assessed for signs of wavering support. It was exhausting. "Vastus came to see me," she said, closing the door behind her. Varion looked up sharply. And she told him about the conversation, the apology, the proposal for truce, the underlying suggestion that she serve as a moderating influence. He listened without interrupting, his expression growing progressively darker. "He's trying to use you," he said when she finished. "Maybe. Or maybe he's genuinely reassessed and realized opposition is pointless. No one reassesses that quickly. Certainly not Vastus. This is strategy." "Probably. But that doesn't mean it's not also an opportunity." To do what? To build actual alliances instead of ruling through fear. To create a coalition of people who support us because it serves their interests rather than because they're terrified of consequences. Valerion stood, moved to the window. "You want me to trust the man who tried to have you exiled. I want you to consider whether permanent opposition is sustainable. You can't threaten everyone into submission forever. Eventually, that approach creates the exact instability you're trying to prevent. So what's the alternative? I accept that Vastus is suddenly my friend. I pretend the last months didn't happen." "No. You accept that people are capable of practical reassessment, that someone who opposed you can become someone who tolerates you if the cost-benefit analysis changes." She moved to stand beside him at the window. "You've spent weeks proving you'll fight for me regardless of cost." That message landed. Now we need to show them there's a path forward that doesn't require constant warfare, that supporting us can be advantageous rather than just less dangerous than opposing us. "You're asking me to moderate. I'm asking you to build rather than just defend." He was quiet for a long time, staring out at the fortress grounds. "I don't know if I can," he said finally. "Every instinct I have says trust no one, accept no compromise, maintain absolute control." "I know. But those instincts are what made you hollow before, what turned power into a prison. And if I moderate and they see it as weakness, if they take advantage of any softening, then we deal with it, together. But we can't rule through threat alone. That's not an empire. That's a hostage situation." He turned to look at her, something raw in his expression. "You're asking me to change everything about how I've survived. I'm asking you to live instead of just survive. There's a difference, is there? Because from where I stand, survival is all that's kept me alive this long, until it started killing you in slower ways." She took his hands. "Valerion, you've proven you're willing to fight for what matters. Now prove you're capable of building something that doesn't require constant warfare to maintain. That's harder than ruling through fear, but it's also the only way forward that doesn't destroy us both. What if I fail? Then we fail together. But we try first." He pulled her against him, holding on like she was the only thing keeping him anchored. "You're going to be the death of me," he murmured. "Or the saving of you. We'll find out. Over the following months, something fundamental began to shift in how the Empire functioned. Varion didn't suddenly become soft or forgiving, but he started building frameworks that rewarded cooperation as well as punishing opposition. Houses that worked constructively with the crown found their concerns addressed, their interests considered. Ceres became the face of that approach, negotiating, mediating, creating structures where loyalty meant partnership rather than submission. It was slow, it was frustrating, and there were setbacks where old patterns reasserted themselves, and Varion had to be talked down from responses that would have undone months of careful relationship building. But gradually, the constant tension that had defined the court began to ease. Not disappearing, that would never happen where power was concerned, but transforming into something more sustainable than perpetual crisis. Vastus became an unexpected ally, his practical nature aligning well with Ceres's focus on functional governance. Other nobles followed his lead, recognizing that cooperation offered advantages opposition couldn't match. The military stabilized as generals saw that strength and humanity weren't mutually exclusive in their king. And through it all, Ceres and Varion learned to navigate the impossible balance of being both powerful and human, of ruling effectively while maintaining the connection that had become central to who they were. It wasn't easy. Some days it felt impossible. But they'd committed to trying, and that commitment carried them through moments when everything threatened to collapse. A year after the council confrontation that had nearly torn everything apart, Ceres stood on the battlements watching winter settle over Nightfall Bastion. Snow had begun to fall, transforming the harsh stone fortress into something almost beautiful. She heard Varion approach before she saw him, recognized his footsteps the way she'd learned to recognize his moods, his silences, the subtle tells that indicated when strategy was warring with emotion. "It's cold," he said, appearing beside her and immediately draping his cloak over her shoulders. "I'm fine. Humor me." She smiled, pulling the cloak tighter. They stood in comfortable silence, watching snow accumulate on the grounds below. "Do you ever regret it?" Varion asked quietly. "Choosing this. Choosing me." The question surprised her. A year ago, he wouldn't have asked, wouldn't have admitted to enough vulnerability to wonder if she might have doubts. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "when the cost feels particularly high. When I think about the life I might have had if I just accepted exile and started over somewhere quiet." He tensed beside her. "But then I remember who I was before," she continued. "Broken, discarded, convinced I'd never matter to anyone. And I realized that even with all the difficulty, I'd rather be here fighting beside you than anywhere else accepting less, even when I'm impossible, especially then. Because impossible means you're still trying, still choosing to be human instead of just a crown." He pulled her against him, and they stood together watching snow transform the world into something clean and new. "I love you," he said. The words still came hard, still felt like admitting to weakness. But he said them anyway because she'd taught him that some weaknesses were actually strengths in disguise. "I know, I love you too." Below them, the fortress continued its eternal rhythms, guards changing shifts, servants managing endless logistics. The machinery of empire grinding forward. But up here, removed from immediate demands, they could just be two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of ruined plans and built something neither had known to want. Mira appeared in the doorway behind them, tactfully clearing her throat. "Your Majesties, the council is gathering for the winter session." Duty called. It always did. But now duty felt different. Not a burden to be endured, but a purpose to be fulfilled. Together they descended from the battlements, moving through corridors that had become home rather than just a strategic position to defend. The council chamber filled with nobles and advisors and generals who no longer looked at Ceres and saw weakness, who'd learned that the queen was formidable in her own right, who understood that the king and queen functioned as a unit rather than crown and decoration. The session proceeded with the organized chaos that characterized imperial governance. Trade disputes were resolved, military positions were reviewed, infrastructure projects were debated and funded, the endless work of keeping an empire functioning. Through it all, Ceres watched Varion navigate between the hard decisiveness that had always defined him and the willingness to consider perspectives that would have been dismissed as irrelevant a year ago. He was still ruthless when necessary, still capable of crushing opposition with surgical precision, But he'd learned to distinguish between threats that required elimination and differences that could be reconciled through negotiation. It was progress, imperfect, ongoing, but real. As the session concluded and nobles began filing out, Vastus approached them both. "Your Majesties," he said, "a word if you have a moment." They moved to a quieter corner of the chamber. Vastus looked between them with an expression that might have been approval. "I wanted to inform you that the Eastern Houses have formally withdrawn their petition regarding succession concerns." "What concerns?" Varian asked, tension immediately entering his posture. There had been some question about whether the Queen's elevation represented a legitimate claim to succession should something happen to you, whether her authority would survive your death or revert to traditional noble houses. Saris felt ice settle in her stomach. She'd known this would come up eventually, the question of what happened if Varian died. But hearing it discussed so clinically was still jarring. And what changed their minds? Varian asked, his voice dangerous. Competence. Vastus's response was blunt. The Queen has demonstrated effective governance. The Empire is measurably stronger with her in a position of authority than it was before. Most houses recognize that destabilizing that arrangement serves no one's interests. He turned to Saris directly. You've earned legitimacy, Your Majesty, not through marriage or title, but through actual effective leadership. That's rare enough to be valuable. After he left, Saris and Varian stood alone in the emptying chamber. That's what you wanted, isn't it? She said quietly. For me to be strong enough that the Empire wouldn't collapse if something happened to you. Yes, though I'd prefer nothing happens to me. We don't always get what we prefer. She turned to face him fully. If the worst happened, if you fell in battle or to assassination or any of the 1,000 ways kings die, would you trust me to hold this together without question? Even though a year ago you would have said caring made you vulnerable, a year ago I was an idiot. He pulled her close. Now I understand that you're not a vulnerability. You're the reason any of this matters. The difference between ruling and just existing. That's a lot of pressure. You can handle it. How do you know? Because I've watched you transform from someone barely surviving into someone who terrifies nobles with your competence. Because you've proven over and over that you're stronger than anyone gave you credit for, including yourself. She rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. I'm still scared sometimes that it will all fall apart, that we'll discover the cost genuinely is too high. So am I. But being scared and being committed aren't mutually exclusive. They stood like that for a long moment, two people holding each other while the weight of an empire settled around them like a cloak they'd learned to wear. The years that followed weren't easy. There were still challenges, still nobles who tested boundaries, still moments when everything threatened to fracture. But the foundation they'd built, based on actual partnership rather than strategic convenience, proved stronger than either had anticipated. Saris expanded her authority beyond trade, becoming involved in judicial reform and infrastructure development. She built a reputation for being fair but demanding, willing to listen but intolerant of incompetence. The merchant classes loved her, the nobility respected her, and the common people began to see the crown as something more than distant authority. Valerion remained the ultimate power, the final authority that couldn't be challenged without catastrophic consequences. But he ruled differently now, still ruthless when necessary, but capable of mercy when appropriate, still demanding absolute loyalty, but rewarding it with genuine consideration rather than just the absence of punishment. Together they transformed what an imperial partnership could look like. Not king and decorative queen, not sovereign and subordinate, but two people of genuine power who'd chosen to build something neither could create alone. On a spring morning 5 years after Saris had first walked into Varion's throne hall, with nothing but desperation and rehearsed words, she stood in the same hall watching a new generation of nobles present their concerns and requests. She'd learned to read the room the way Varian did, to see beneath courtly language to the calculations driving every interaction. Beside her, Varian handled each petitioner with the efficiency of long practice. But between official business, his hand would find hers, a casual gesture that would have been unthinkable when she'd first arrived. Public displays of connection were still limited. Some barriers of royal dignity remained, but the court had learned to read those small touches as communication about unity and shared authority. After the formal session concluded, they returned to the private study that had become their planning space. Maps covered every surface, not of military campaigns now, but of infrastructure projects and trade routes and development initiatives. The eastern provinces need better roads, Ceres said, reviewing the latest reports. We're losing too much efficiency to transportation bottlenecks. Expensive. Less expensive than the lost revenue from inefficient trade. I can show you the calculations. I believe you. He moved behind her, reading over her shoulder. How quickly can it be implemented? 2 years if we start next spring. 3 if we wait for better weather. Then we start next spring. It was these moments, the casual partnership in governance, the trust in each other's expertise, the shared commitment to building rather than just maintaining, that reminded Ceres how far they'd come from that first desperate bargain. "Do you remember," she said, "what you told me the night before we went to Aldrich's wedding? That you needed to survive whatever came next. You said you couldn't fight effectively if you were worried about keeping me safe, that I needed to be strong enough to hold the fortress while you handled the battlefield." I remember. I think about that sometimes, about how you saw strength in me before I saw it in myself. Varion turned her to face him. I saw what you'd survived, what you were willing to risk. That kind of strength doesn't disappear just because circumstances break you. It waits for the right moment to resurface. She pulled him down into a kiss that tasted like spring air and new beginnings, and the particular flavor of love that had been forged in fire and refused to break. When they separated, he rested his forehead against hers. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For saving me from becoming the thing I was turning into, for refusing to let me hide behind strategy and control, for showing me that being human doesn't make you weak, it makes you whole. You did the same for me. Gave me power when I had nothing, defended me when I couldn't defend myself, chose me when every rational calculation said you shouldn't. So we saved each other, apparently. Not a bad foundation for an empire, not bad at all." That evening, they stood together on the same battlements where they'd watched snowfall years before. But now spring had transformed the fortress grounds into something alive with possibility. Gardens that Ceres had insisted on planting were beginning to bloom. Construction on new administrative buildings that would house the expanded governance structure was progressing on schedule. The empire they were building looked different than the one Varion had conquered through force. More collaborative, more stable, based on structures that rewarded cooperation as well as punishing opposition. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was real in a way that pure calculation could never achieve. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd sent me away?" Ceres asked. "If you'd accepted exile as the price of peace?" "Sometimes. Usually when I'm trying to fall asleep and my brain insists on exploring nightmare scenarios. And what do you think would have happened? I'd have saved the empire and lost myself. Would have proven I could make the hard choice and spent the rest of my life regretting it. Would have been exactly what they wanted, a king who valued power over everything else and hated every moment of it. So no regrets. About choosing you. Never. About the cost it demanded. About the difficulties it created. About having to fight battles I might have avoided if I just sacrificed you to convenience." He turned to face her fully. "But every single one of those costs was worth it, because the alternative was living without the only person who's ever made me feel like power was worth having." She leaned against him, and they stood together watching the sun set over an empire that was theirs in every sense that mattered. Years from now, historians would debate whether Varion Thorn's decision to elevate and defend his queen represented weakness or evolution, whether love had compromised his judgment or expanded it, whether the empire was stronger or weaker for having a partnership at its center rather than a solitary sovereign. But in that moment, standing on battlements as spring gave way to summer and the world transformed around them, none of those questions mattered. What mattered was two people who'd found each other in the wreckage of impossible circumstances and built something that survived not despite their connection, but because of it. What mattered was an empire learning that strength didn't require isolation, that power could coexist with humanity, that choosing to care wasn't weakness, it was the hardest kind of courage. What mattered was a king who'd discovered that the crown meant nothing if wearing it required him to be hollow, and a queen who'd learned that survival wasn't enough when you could choose to live instead. Together they'd proven that the old rules about power-demanding sacrifice were wrong, or at least incomplete. Because yes, power demanded sacrifice, but it demanded sacrifice of pride, not connection, of isolation, not love, of the comfortable fiction that invulnerability was the same as strength. The real sacrifice wasn't what you gave up. It was what you chose to risk by refusing to give up anything that actually mattered. And in the end, that made all the difference. Mira found them there as full darkness settled and stars began to emerge overhead. She carried a message that needed attention, some crisis that required royal decision. The work never ended. The demands never stopped. But now, when duty called, they answered together. Two people who'd learned that the hardest battles weren't fought on battlefields, but in the quiet moments when you had to choose between what was easy and what was right. They'd chosen right, over and over, despite cost, despite risk, despite every rational calculation that said sentiment was liability. And they'd built something that would outlast them both. An empire where power and humanity weren't opposites but partners, where the crown represented not just authority but responsibility, where strength meant the courage to be vulnerable and wisdom meant knowing the difference between threats that required elimination and differences that could be reconciled. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. As they descended from the battlements to handle whatever crisis Mara had brought them, Ceres felt Varion's hand find hers in the darkness. A simple gesture, unremarkable to anyone watching, but to them it meant everything. It meant partnership. It meant trust. It meant that whatever came next, they'd face it the way they'd faced everything since that moment in the throne hall when a desperate woman and a lonely king had made a bargain that transformed into something neither had known to want. Together. Always together. And that was the real victory, not the empire they'd built or the enemies they'd defeated or the power they wielded, but the simple revolutionary act of choosing each other, every single day, regardless of cost. That was the story worth telling. The lesson worth learning, the truth worth defending. Love wasn't weakness, connection wasn't compromise, and the hardest kind of strength was the willingness to risk everything by refusing to sacrifice what actually mattered. They'd learned it the hard way, through fire and blood and impossible choices, but they'd learned it, and that made all the difference. The empire endured, the throne remained, power continued its eternal dance, but for the first time in its history, the crown wasn't a prison. It was a partnership, and that changed everything.